Okay, Morten, take it away.
Okay, so welcome everybody to the second edition of the Copenhagen Macro Days conference. It's going to be running over today and the following 2 days. Before we kick it off, let me just hand over to Christian Schulz, who is the head of Department of Economics at Copenhagen University.
Thank you, Morten, and welcome to everybody. I'm honored to be allowed to introduce this stuff. It's an impressive conference you have set up. It usually runs for 2 days, one at the Department of Economics, one at the Danish Central Bank. This year we will have 3 days in a row. The first day will be with young scholars who have made excellent job market papers. So we will have a number of presentations right after this. I should remember to say that we are very, very happy to UniCredit for sponsoring the Best Paper Award. And I should also say that we are very happy to the organizing group for setting together a terrific program. So I look forward to see what is to come, and welcome to everybody to this fantastic event.
Yeah, thanks for that, Christian. Yeah, so we'll have 3 days. On day 1, we'll have 4 juniors that we picked from this year's junior job market, which seems like ages and ages ago for some reason. Yeah, so we have 4 of, we selected what we thought were 4 of the most exciting papers out there. On day 2, we will have a plenary session or a keynote by Gauti Ekkertsen on the zero lower bound, and then we're going to have papers by Kurt Mittman and by Mike Bauer. On day 3, we'll have a keynote by Pierre Cruzel on climate, and then papers on sovereign debt on debt by Caterina Mendicino and Cristina Ariano. And at the end of day 3, we will have the award ceremony where we'll select the prize winner among the 4 presentations today. And before we kick off, let me just lay out the ground rules here. So everyone's audio and video is going to be muted. You cannot yourself change this, and we will only do if we have told you beforehand. If you have questions to the papers during the talk, then post them in Q&A, not in the chat, but in the Q&A. Then the session chairman will select the questions from there. And in any case, if you have questions or comments, they will be sent afterwards to the presenter. So please use the Q&A, not the chat. And one more thing that we haven't announced is that at the end of the day, when everything stops, there will be an opportunity to meet up virtually for drinks and post-presentation discussions. We may have breakout rooms with the presenters, and I will post a link to that Zoom session in the chat. Okay, so with that, let me hand over to our very first speaker, who is Elisa Rubbo, who's going to talk about monetary policy and network. Elisa, the word is yours.
Thank you, and thank you very much for inviting me to present here. Can you see my slides right now?
Yeah.
Perfect. All right, so today I'm going to present on networks, Phillips curves, and monetary policy. In this paper, I built a framework to study monetary policy in an economy with many sectors that buy and sell intermediate inputs from each other. So just to give you a reference point, the main framework for monetary policy comes from the New Keynesian model. And in the textbook model, we have a central bank that seeks to stabilize employment and prices in response to productivity fluctuations. In this baseline model, there is a strong relation between prices and employment called the Phillips curve. And we have a very special results that tells us that prices are stabilized if and only if employment is stabilized. And this result is commonly referred to as the divine coincidence. So what this tells us is that there is no trade-off between the 2 objectives of the central bank. And from a practical point of view, this also means that the optimal policy can be implemented simply by stabilizing inflation. And this is an important result because inflation is much easier to stabilize than the output gap or the employment gap. With many sectors, things change quite a bit. So the first fundamental question is, how do we define inflation? And in the one sector context, it is obvious inflation is the change in price of the only good in the economy. But as soon as we have many sectors, then what is the relevant measure of prices for monetary policy? Should it be consumer prices, producer prices, core inflation, something else? And the one sector model, of course, is silent about this. A second question that the model cannot answer is, how does the input-output structure affect the relation between employment and prices given by the Phillips curve? And this is also an important question because from an empirical point of view, we don't observe a very strong relation between consumer prices and employment. And this is an important puzzle. And finally, with many sectors, inflation and employment could be moving around in different ways across sectors. And again, the textbook model doesn't tell us how the central bank should respond and how it should trade off inflation in different sectors and employment. So to address all of these questions, I revisit the New Keynesian framework and I rederive analytically the two key objects that are the backbone of the optimal monetary policy problem. And these two objects are the Phillips curve that we mentioned before and the welfare loss function. So as we said, the Phillips curve is a linear relation between inflation on the left-hand side and employment or the output gap. The two here are equivalent on the right-hand side. As we said, with multiple sectors, we can have many inflation measures. And so here, pi bar on the left-hand side can be any inflation measure. And depending on our choice of an index and on the network structure, this Phillips curve will have different parameters. So they will have different slope and different intercept or different residual. Second element is the welfare loss function. So in the one sector model, this loss is quadratic in the output gap and sector and aggregate inflation, reflecting the fact that the central bank is trying to stabilize both. With multiple sectors, we still have that welfare is decreasing quadratically in the aggregate output or employment gap, but it is a more complicated function of inflation. And I will show you that we need to consider the full distribution of sectoral inflation rates to derive welfare. So digging a bit deeper into the theoretical results, I first derive Phillips curves for any inflation index. So we can derive a general formula that applies to all indexes, and we can also derive some results that are general. First, I find that all these Phillips curves become flatter the more intermediate input linkages are present in the economy. And this is important because it speaks to the empirical puzzle that the Phillips curves seem to be flatter than the textbook model predicts. Second, I find that all of these Phillips curves have an endogenous residual, UT, that moves around with productivity shocks. So it is important to note that whenever we have this residual, the divine coincidence result breaks. And in fact, you can see that even if the output gap is closed, YT equal to 0, in the presence of a residual, then inflation is not stabilized. So in other words, it is not equivalent anymore to stabilize employment or to stabilize prices. And this is true for all possible measures of aggregate inflation, except for a very special one that I derive in the paper and I will show you later. And I call this new measure the divine coincidence inflation index. This measure is going to be different from consumer prices, and it will serve as a sufficient statistic for aggregate output gap, reflecting the fact precisely that it is stabilized if and only if output gap is stabilized. And more in general, this measure preserves all the positive properties of inflation in the baseline model. Second block of theoretical results is about welfare. So as we said before, the welfare function is still quadratic in the output gap and sectoral inflation rates. Here, I show that the output gap captures deviations of aggregate output from the efficient level, whereas inflation rates will reflect deviations of sectoral relative outputs from the efficient level. The optimal monetary policy will try to address both of these distortions, and in general, it will not be able to eliminate all of them at the same time. So nonetheless, even if we have to live in a second-best world, the optimal monetary policy can still be implemented via inflation targeting. However, the inflation target is going to be very different from consumer prices, and from a theoretical standpoint, it is also going to be different from the divine coincidence index, because the optimal policy now does not just stabilize the aggregate output gap, but it also seeks to stabilize distortions between sectors. From a quantitative point of view, I construct a time series of the divine coincidence index that comes out of the model, and I run Phillips curve regressions with this index and with traditional measures of consumer prices. I find that the model, when I calibrate it to the US economy, predicts correctly the regression coefficients that I estimate. And I also find that the R squared is 2 to 4 times larger in the divine coincidence specification relative to traditional specifications with consumer prices. And it is consistent with the fact that this specification gives us a stronger Phillips curve without this endogenous residual. The model also, when I calibrate it to historical input-output data for the US, predicts that the Phillips curve, the consumer price Phillips curve, should have flattened over time by about 30%, whereas the wage Phillips curve should have remained stable. And again, this is consistent with empirical evidence. In terms of welfare, I calibrate the welfare loss from business cycles under different policy rules. And I find that this welfare loss is larger than 1% of per period GDP if the central bank targets consumer inflation. And it can be reduced to 0.3% by switching to the optimal policy. I also find that from a quantitative point of view, closing the output gap is close to the optimal policy. To just give you a sense of the magnitude of these numbers, we can compare them with the Lucas estimate of the welfare loss from fluctuations in consumption in the efficient equilibrium with flexible prices. And here this welfare loss is 0.05% of per period GDP. So it's an order of magnitude smaller than the loss with under optimal policy. And this points at the fact that introducing these pricing frictions really changes a lot the welfare implications of the model. So I'll skip the literature in the interest of time. And here is a roadmap of the presentation today. First, I will present the key elements of the network model. Then I will move on to describing the positive results about the Phillips curve. So I will give you a sketch of the derivation. I will derive the divine coincidence index, show you how it weights sectoral inflation rates, and then I will move on to the quantitative results in the calibration and regressions. And finally, I will discuss optimal monetary policy. So I will derive the loss function, derive the optimal inflation target, and do the quantitative exercise about welfare loss from business cycles. So here is the setup. The consumption side of the model is standard. We will have a representative consumer who buys potentially all of the goods in the economy, and he has homothetic preferences over these goods. This representative agent also has some disutility from labor supply. So the overall utility function is as you can see on the slide. And finally, today I will present a static version of the model where monetary policy works through printing money. And we have a cash in advance constraint whereby aggregate nominal expenditure cannot exceed the money supply. However, all the results that I present today extend naturally to a dynamic version of the model where the central bank is setting interest rates. On the production side, we will have n sectors in the economy, and n is a totally general number. Within each sector, there will be a continuum of firms selling differentiated varieties, and customers buy a CS bundle of these varieties. So basically, we are replicating within each sector the structure that was in the baseline one sector model. At the sector level, the production function has constant returns to scale, and it takes as input intermediate goods that can be potentially any good produced in the economy and labor. Sectors are also faced with sector-specific TFP shifters that I denote by capital A. To model price rigidities, I assume that within each sector, only a fraction of the producers can adjust their price after they see the realization of productivity and the response of monetary policy. And I denote by delta I the fractions of producers who can adjust their price in each sector I. Within this framework, it is also very easy to model sticky wages. And I do this by adding a labor sector that hires all the workers and sells their service to the other sectors. And this sector will have sticky prices. Finally, I assume that there are optimal subsidies in place to get rid of markup distortions that arise from this CAS structure within sectors. So the equilibrium with productivity equal to its expected value is going to be efficient. And I log linearize the model around this efficient equilibrium. The log linearized model depends on a small set of variables and parameters. And the parameters are given by the sector level labor input, consumption shares, and sales shares. So labor shares are denoted by this vector alpha, with components alpha I being the share of wages in sector I total cost. The input-output matrix is omega with elements omega ij, given by the share of sector J in I's cost. Consumption shares are given by beta, with component beta I given by the share of sector I in total consumption expenditure. And finally, lambda I is going to be the sales share of sector I in total GDP. I then collect sector level adjustment probabilities in this diagonal matrix, capital delta. And finally, the last set of parameters that we need are the elasticities of substitution in production and consumption. And this will be necessary when we solve for welfare. In terms of variables, I solved the model as a function of the aggregate output gap and sectoral inflation rates. The aggregate output gap is defined as usual as the log difference between realized output and efficient output. Whereas sectoral inflation rates are collected in the vector pi, and here pi I is going to be inflation in sector I. All right, so this was a lot of notation, and now we are ready to move on to the positive results about Phillips curves. Here the general method is as follows. First step, I derive a vector of Phillips curves at the sector level. So this Phillips curve will tell us the response of the price in sector I to changes in the output gap and productivity in all sectors. So the output gap is an aggregate one-dimensional variable, whereas productivity shocks are going to be a vector of sector level shocks. Here, these Phillips curve depend on two elasticities that I call B and V. So B is the elasticity of inflation with respect to the output gap. And it has component BI that tells us the response of prices in sector I to aggregate output gap. The matrix V instead has element Vij that tell us the response of prices in sector I to a productivity shock in sector J. And importantly, B and V are equilibrium objects that incorporate the response of prices and wages to productivity and monetary policy through the output gap. So the heavy lifting from an analytical point of view is in deriving these equilibrium objects. once we have these objects, we can derive also the aggregate Phillips curve for any inflation measure of our choice. And to do this, we just need to recognize that different inflation measures are characterized by their weighting of sectoral inflation rates that here I denote by phi. And so different measures of aggregate inflation will have different weighted average, different phi's, but the slope of the aggregate Phillips curve is going to be given just by the combination of the sectoral elasticities. So it's going to be the aggregate elasticity with respect to the output gap, whereas the residual of the Phillips curve will be the aggregate elasticity with respect to productivity. I will not give you in this presentation the full derivation of these equilibrium objects, BMV, but I will give you a sense of the mechanisms that are at play in the concrete example of the consumer price Phillips curve. So here we will start by looking at the slope, kappa c, of this consumer price Phillips curve. The slope captures the response of consumer prices to a 1% increase in the employment gap. What's the intuition here? Well, if employment goes up by 1%, this means that labor demand has gone up. And to make agents willing to work, we need to increase their real wage. And in turn, real wages will mean higher marginal costs and therefore higher prices. I find that the mapping between the output gap and real wages is independent of the structure of the production network, but it only depends on the parameters gamma and phi of the labor supply curve. By contrast, the pass-through of real wages into consumer prices crucially depends on the network structure. And to capture this, I define this sufficient statistic delta W, that is the pass-through of nominal wages into consumer prices. Just to give you some intuition, why does the network structure matter? Well, here we can think of an output gap shock as a shock to wages that hits the first sectors, the most upstream sectors, and then these sectors will pass through the shock to their buyers. And then we have this shock that needs to travel all along down a production chain until it reaches the final consumers, and so the final consumer prices. At each step of this chain, potentially we have some price rigidity. And so this shock will get dampened because producers do not fully adjust their price to reflect the change in wages. And that is why the longer the chain, the more this shock gets dampened, and so the smaller the effect of a change in wages on consumer prices. So formally, the expression for the pass-through of nominal wages into consumer prices is as on the slide here. We can identify two components in this effect, in this expression. Here we have on one hand a direct pass-through that tells us for a given shock to a sector I's marginal cost, what is going to be the change in consumer prices. And then we have a second term that tells us for a given change in wages, what is going to be the effect on each sector marginal cost. So first, we want to go from a given marginal cost change in sector I to consumer prices. And to do this, we will need sector I's consumption share and its price adjustment frequency. So basically, this direct pass-through tells us that sectors with larger consumption share or more flexible prices have a larger impact on consumer inflation. How about the second component? Well, this tells us for a given wage shock, what's the effect on sectoral marginal cost? Well, here we see that this component depends on the labor share alpha because we are looking at the effect of a wage shock. But then it also depends on this complicated inverse matrix. And for those of you who are more familiar with the network literature, this is a sort of Leontief inverse. And a Leontief inverse is a matrix that captures the effect of a shock on each sector based on how much of this shock impacts them directly and how much impacts them through their supplier and how much through their supplier's suppliers and so on. And so this inverse reflects a geometric sum that accounts for the effect along supply chains of different lengths from 0 to infinity. In this Leontief inverse, the relevant matrix is not just the input-output matrix omega, but we need to discount this matrix by the price adjustment frequencies. And the intuition here is that the importance of each sector, J for sector I, is not just given by its input share, omega ij, but it is discounted by the fraction of producers in sector J that adjust their price, because the producer who do not adjust will not transmit wage shocks. Why is it important to account for all these effects? Well, crucially, I find that in a network model, as long as there is some price rigidity, this pass-through term of the wage shock into marginal cost is always going to be less than 1. Whereas without intermediate inputs, this pass-through is always 1. So, and this is precisely coming from the fact that there is this dampening through sticky intermediate prices. And this is very important because it tells us that the overall pass-through is going to be smaller than in a model where we ignore input-output linkages. And therefore, when we plug in the pass-through into the expression of the slope, we are going to obtain something smaller than in the one-sector model or in a model without input-output linkages. Then you might ask, well, all right, but is this important from a quantitative point of view? And my answer is yes. So what I find is that calibrating the model to the US economy, in the full calibration that accounts for the full input-output structure, the slope is about 0.1, whereas in the textbook model that doesn't account for sticky wages or intermediate inputs, the slope is larger than 1. So basically ignoring the input-output structure and sticky wages leads us to a slope that is more than tenfold the slope that the full calibration would imply. This effect also shows up, the effect of the input-output structure also shows up when we look at historical data. So here to construct this graph, I use input-output data from the BEA that go from 1947 to 2017. And the blue line here represents the slope of the Phillips curve implied by the model using data from each of the years in the sample. And we see that the implied slope has declined by about 30%. What has determined this change? Well, there are two possible channels here reflecting the expression for the pass-through that we have seen before. It could be a change in consumption shares towards stickier sectors, or it could be an increase in the usage of intermediate inputs that has affected the overall slope. So to disentangle these two effects, I do two exercises. First, I keep input-output shares constant at their 1947 value and let consumption shares change as in the data. And second, I keep the consumption shares constant and let the input-output structure vary. And I find that precisely the component coming from the input-output structure is the dominant one. So let me move on maybe a little faster. Okay, sorry. So now the second important parameters in the Phillips curve is going to be the slope, the residual. And the residual, as we said before, captures the effect of productivity on consumer prices. So here we have, the intuition is that we have two effects. First, we have a direct effect of productivity on marginal costs. If productivity goes down, marginal costs go up. But then we also have an indirect effect that comes from the fact that whenever productivity goes down, the marginal product of labor goes down, and so wages go down. Overall, the effect on consumer prices is captured by the relative pass-through of the change in productivity and the change in wages. And these two are, in the one sector model, these two are exactly identical. And that's where the divine coincidence comes from. Whereas in the multi-sector model, I find that the two are different, both at the sector level and in the aggregate. And to give you a sense of the magnitude of the residual that that is present in the consumer price Phillips curve, I construct a time series of these residual based on sectoral TFP shocks. And you can see it's pretty volatile. The standard deviation is 25 basis points. So to sum up, the consumer price Phillips curve has a slope that changes over time with the production structure, and it is very noisy because it has this endogenous residual or cost push shock coming from sector level TFP shocks. So one would wonder, is there a better inflation index that gives us a stronger Phillips curve? And the answer is yes. We can look at the divine coincidence inflation index. And this index weights sectors according to their sales shares and discounts more flexible sectors. And the intuition here is that the sales shares, as opposed to consumption shares, gives us a measure of the full role of each sector in the production chain. And we want to discount more flexible sectors precisely because for a given shock, prices in this sector respond more. Overall, I showed that this divine coincidence index gives us a Phillips curve whose slope is independent of the network. It only depends on the parameters of labor supply curve. And this Phillips curve will have no endogenous cost push shock. So here are, in practice, the weightings in the divine coincidence index as compared with core PCE, which is a standard measure of consumer prices for the US. So we see in the solid bar represent the divine coincidence index and the lighter bar, the PCE. So we see that in the divine coincidence index, the highest weight goes to wages because wages are sticky and labor is a very important input for all sectors. And then after wages, we have professional services and finance, which are both large and sticky sectors. Whereas for PCE, the highest weight goes to healthcare, housing, and non-durables, which are large sector in total consumption, but not as large in terms of total sales. So I also once I construct the divine coincidence index, I also run Phillips curve regressions with this index and with consumer prices, which is the standard specification. And I find that the model predicts the slope of the two Phillips curve correctly. So here you can see the slopes predicted by the model and the slope in the data. And we see that they are in the same ballpark. And I also find that the R squared of the divine coincidence specification is much larger than the R squared with any of the consumer price specifications. And this is true both for the full sample and across different samples, different time periods. So here I'm showing the coefficient estimate for 20-year rolling regressions. And I find that in the divine coincidence specification, the coefficient is always significant and always of the right sign, whereas with consumer prices, it often has the wrong sign and it is rarely significant. And in terms of R squared, we also see that the divine coincidence specification always dominates. All right, so this is it for the positive part. In the last few minutes, I will just give you a sense of the optimal policy part. So to study optimal policy, I derive a second order approximation of the welfare function around the flex price outcome. And I find that the welfare function depends quadratically on the output gap, which captures distortions in aggregate demand, and on inflation rate, which capture distortions in relative demand across sectors. So intuitively, whenever we have some inflation, this points at the fact that there is a price distortion, either between different sectors or within a sector between different firms. And this price distortion triggers a substitution by customers towards the varieties or the sectors which are too cheap relative to the efficient outcome. And the quantity response will be larger, the larger the elasticity of substitution. This quantity distortion, in turn, is equivalent to a productivity loss with respect to the efficient allocation. So overall, the welfare function will depend on sectoral elasticities of substitution and on the input-output structure, which determines the propagation of price distortions. We can then revisit the central bank's problem using this updated objective function. And as a constraint, we will now have the full vector of sectoral Phillips curves. We then obtain the optimal trade-off between aggregate output and sectoral inflation rates. And this trade-off gives us the marginal gain from changing the output gap for misallocation across sectors against the marginal cost given by the distortion in aggregate demand. From this optimality condition, we can immediately derive our new inflation target just by remembering that we can replace the output gap with the divine coincidence inflation index. And therefore, we find a policy target that is positive if and only if the output gap is above optimal. In terms of calibration, just to give you a sense of the importance of different assumptions for the optimal policy results, here I calibrate the full input-output model, assuming different distributions of sectoral shocks. In the baseline, I just calibrate sectoral productivity shocks from TFP data. In the only idiosyncratic scenario, I assume that there are only idiosyncratic shocks or only aggregate shocks in this scenario, and I always keep the variance of aggregate productivity constant. And we see that in all scenarios, targeting consumer price inflation, as pictured by the yellow bar, gives us a very large welfare loss, whereas targeting the output gap is the red bar is close to the optimal policy as represented by the blue bar. But importantly, even under the optimal policy, we see that in the baseline scenario, we have a pretty large welfare loss, about 0.3% of per period GDP. And this welfare loss is much reduced if instead we consider a model that has the same number of sectors, but no input-output linkages. And in this scenario, we also find that consumer price inflation is a good target. So these results point at the fact that accounting properly for the input-output structure is crucial. So I think I'm out of time. So to conclude, today I presented a new framework for monetary policy in a disaggregated economy with many sectors and a general input-output structure. I derive Phillips curves for any specification of aggregate inflation, and I find that all these Phillips curves become flatter due to the presence of intermediate inputs, and all these Phillips curves have an endogenous residual or endogenous cost per shock. All Phillips curves except for one, which is the Phillips curve that we construct with the divine coincidence index. In terms of welfare, I find that targeting consumer prices as is currently done is not a good policy, but the output gap instead is a good target, and the optimal policy can still be implemented via inflation targeting, and I provide the correct weights for this optimal policy. All right, thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Elisa, for that. That was very interesting. Yeah, let me remind the audience, the attendees, to use the Q&A. If you want to ask a question, I'll select from there. Let me just ask the first question, and then we have a few more. I think we have like 7-8 minutes for questions. So this, in terms of, it seems to. You showed evidence that seems to indicate that changing the input structure seems to been important for the change in inflation dynamics. So I'm wondering, what are your thoughts on? Should we think of the network as a structural? Is that a structural parameter, or is that something that's actually endogenous in itself? And would that be something that's important to think a bit more about or not?
Yeah, so I think there are definitely reasons why we could think that monetary policy could influence the shape of the network. I think among all forces that influence it, probably monetary policy is not the most important. So I think within a model of monetary policy, I feel quite comfortable about taking the network structure as a primitive, but I definitely agree that it is a thing that is constantly evolving, and it is definitely not independent of policy. So there are very interesting recent papers. Just for example, there is a Grossman-Helpman paper that is about tariffs and supply chains, but I'm sure there is a lot more that show especially how trade policy or maybe some labor policies affect the structure of the network. And that's something that also monetary policymakers will want to keep an eye on, given the importance of the network structure for policy transmission.
Yeah, I guess what I had in mind is sort of if markups differ in systematic ways with policy, and there's a choice of the network that might sort of feed through. That actually links up a little bit with a question from the audience, from Francesco Furno. So say you had like a menu cost model.
Mm-hmm.
Would the result you have on limited pass-through, would that still hold true?
All right, so the answer is a little tricky from a theoretical point of view because this would change a bit the setup. I think from a quantitative point of view, there are network models that introduce menu costs, and what they find is that the intuition doesn't change. So usually the response in menu cost models is a bit smaller than in a Calvo model because if the shock is small enough, people don't adjust, but if it's large enough, then a lot of people adjust. So you have a bit less monetary non-neutrality. But on the other hand, the comparison between input-output network model and standard model actually is pretty similar in the quantitatively in the menu cost versus the Calvo specification. So I would expect that the same intuitions carry through, with the caveat that these delta parameters are going to be endogenous. And of course, that's going to depend on policy.
Okay. Then I think we also had questions from some of the panelists, Federico Aravenna, maybe Cristina Ariano. Maybe Federico, maybe you go first. You need to unmute yourself.
Yes, Elisa, thanks for presenting the paper. You have a very interesting example in your appendix about an oil price shock. And oil is interesting because it's a commodity which has very little demand share in the input-output table, but very large input share because it's an input into nearly everything. So I was thinking if you could discuss a bit more the transmission of an oil shock and how is it that such an upstream shock seems in the economy to pass through consumer prices faster than other upstream shocks? Thank you.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So what I find is that you can pretty much replicate the pass-through of an oil shock in the US economy with a much simpler economy, where you think of having 3 steps. One is labor, and then you have oil, and then you have final goods. And there are 2 characteristics of oil that are salient. One is that the oil prices themselves are very flexible. And the second characteristic is that there appears to be a positive correlation between the oil input share of various sectors and their price flexibility. So basically, sectors that use more oil also have more flexible prices. And so both of these things, like oil prices are flexible and oil customers have flexible prices, both these things make the oil price pass-through be much larger than the pass-through of other upstream inputs. And in fact, from an optimal policy point of view, it turns out that what matters the most is not that oil is an upstream input, actually quite the opposite. It matters that wages are sticky and oil prices are flexible. So actually the response to an oil shock is much more similar to the response to a very downstream shock when you look at optimal policy than to an upstream shock.
Thank you.
Okay.
Yes.
So I think we have time for one last question. So I'll hand over to Cristina Ariano.
Yes, so I enjoyed very much the paper, and I actually had the question of oil, so this was very useful. Another application, of course, is the COVID situation, where you have all these sort of very large shocks hitting sectors in different ways. And I have a question of your thoughts on using your framework for analyzing large shocks. I guess a question on the linear approximation, and also your thoughts on whether you've done or you've thought about the sort of this COVID shock from the point of view of inflation.
Yeah, so no, that's a great question. From the point of view of large shocks, I think the main limitation of my framework is that in this linear approximation, I'm not capturing changes in sectoral shares. So for the Phillips curve. So basically, I would be missing, if there is a big reallocation towards a sticky sector, then we would have a flatter Phillips curve. If we're reallocating towards a flexible sector, it would be steeper. So all these things I'm missing for the Phillips curve. In terms of in terms of implications of COVID specifically, I think another important element that is missing in the model is that here I have a representative agent that supplies labor to all sectors. Whereas I think a very important aspect of the COVID crisis is that it affects different workers differently. So for this, I have a companion project where I have segmented labor markets. So different workers can be hired by all sectors, but they cannot switch, they're not interchangeable. And so I think this is a much more suited framework to analyze shocks like COVID. I have not done a quantitative application to COVID, and right now I'm more interested in in exploring the effect of, rather than optimal policy, I'm more interested in a positive description of giving a subsidy or spending on a sector, and like what's the effect on the different labor markets and on aggregate output. And I find that it's like the pattern of spending and fiscal transfers across sectors or worker groups leads to different implications for aggregate output or employment, even for the same nominal spending. So I think this is, I think this framework I'm working on is more promising, even if I have not done the quantitative part. And of course, I would point you to Manuel's and David's paper on COVID that is definitely like a more specific application.
Okay, we'll take one very last super quick question from Ellen Ray, and then we'll move on to the next paper. Ellen?
Well, I hope it's super quick. It seems to me that, you know, for the ECB, it would be very interesting to think in terms of your framework for the euro area. And have you given any thought about networks which have a regional component, so which have connections which are relatively dense geographically for some areas, and then which have only a few connections, for example, across countries? So have you already thought of how the network structure impacts the effect on the Phillips curve and potential applications for the ECB?
Yeah, so I have not thought about this dichotomy between dense network within a region and more sparse across regions. That would be a very interesting example. I think the project that is closer to ECB framework that I have is the companion paper with this segmented labor market, where you could identify a labor market with a country. And I think that would be the most relevant framework. Yeah, as I said before, it would give, I mean, my aim with that paper is to say, okay, well, let's say that there is a one-size-fits-all monetary policy that say we are printing money. How does this affect different countries? Is this going to boost employment more in one country or the other, based on the input-output structure that is within that is there within and across countries? I thought I would approach this problem more from a quantitative point of view. So let's go to the data, see what's the input-output structure, and see what the implication of the model is.
Okay.
But your suggestion is great. Yeah.
I think we probably should stop here, but let me remind everybody that after everything stops today, then there's another Zoom session where we can discuss further. Let's thank Elisa a lot for a very interesting paper. It's going to be exciting to see how things develop for you. And next speaker is Christian Wolf, who will talk about the missing intercept.
Yep, thank you. Let me just share my screen. One second. Can you see everything? Does it look good?
Yeah, looks good.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much. Thanks for inviting me, for putting the paper on the program. So as Martin said, I'm going to be talking about my job market paper, The Missing Intercept, a Demand Equivalence Approach. Okay, and because this is a kind of short talk, what I'll do is I'll mostly talk about one very particular, I think, policy relevant question that you can hope to shed some light on using that titular demand equivalence approach. And that question is whether kind of a one-off deficit finance lump sum transfer paid out to households actually manages to stimulate aggregate consumption. Now, why is this not working? No? Okay. Now, ideally, to address that question, what you would want is some kind of exogenous variation in the amount of transfers paid out to households in the time series. And then you could use the kind of conventional local projections of the AR toolkit to estimate the desired aggregate macro consumption counterfactual. Problem is, for that particular policy, but also for many others of interest, it's difficult to find such variation in the time series, just because, well, here the example of a transfer, those are usually paid out in response to changing macroeconomic conditions. Now, what the approach developed in this paper hopes to offer is a kind of alternative way of getting at this macro counterfactual in a semi-structural way, so without tying yourself to a particular structural model of the macroeconomy. And it effectively does that by using different kinds of cross-sectional and time series variation to mimic that ideal but unavailable time series experiment. And as I work out in the paper, that kind of approach is applicable to what I would argue is a quite general family of shifters of consumption and investment spending, formally defined in the paper. But for the talk today, just keep in mind it's going to be something that's applicable to that example of the deficit finance transfer. Very big picture, the way the approach works is in two steps. One is not at all novel to what I'm doing. It's just, I mean, a lot of existing work has argued that if there's nothing great we can leverage in the time series, maybe we can look at the shock of interest in the cross-section, here in the cross-section of households, and use something like RCTs, lottery wins, surveys to elicit how an individual household, in terms of its consumption decisions, would respond to receipt of, say, a $500 transfer. Now, the well-known problem of that cross-sectional approach is that the econometric estimate of those cross-sectional studies, you can't interpret them as the macro counterfactual that you're interested in. Specifically, they're missing what I refer to in the paper as the kind of missing general equilibrium intercept of, say, wages going up and crowding in consumption, interest rates going up, crowding out consumption, for example. Now, the actual contribution of the paper lies in the second part, where I use general equilibrium theory to, first of all, formally work out what this cross-sectional regression is missing, but then argue that time series variation for other shocks that we may actually have a hope to identify something in the time series, under some restrictions actually give us precisely the part that the cross-sectional diff and diff style estimates are missing. And the takeaway from the talk today will be that if you believe the restrictions coming from the general equilibrium theory that I'll develop, as well as my cross-sectional measurement, as well as that time series measurement for other shocks, then you'll be forced to conclude that even though this kind of micro diff and diff causal effect is not theoretically the right object to look at, it is actually going to be very close to the true overall estimated macro counterfactual. And so in particular, it's going to indicate that after a one-off lump sum deficit finance transfer, consumption increases briefly but significantly. Now, the talk will proceed in two steps. One is developing the theory and then implementing the measurement. And let me just, before I dive into those details, give you a very quick overview of that. So everything I'll do on the kind of theory side will be developed within the confines of what I refer to as a reasonably general kind of quantitative business cycle model. So it's going to be a model that's designed to nest the frameworks that you would usually think about to recover those counterfactuals in a fully structural way. So it's going to nest in the familiar RBC model, New Keynesian DSGEs, but also the more recently popular Hank models or heterogeneous firm models. Now, first thing is kind of obvious. In that framework, you can just decompose to first order the overall response of consumption to your policy of interest, that deficit finance transfer, into two parts. One is what I call the direct response, which is just kind of answering the question, if I gave these $500 to an individual household and like didn't change anything else in the macroeconomy, how would consumption of that kind of average household respond? Second part is the inverse of that. What would happen if I changed wages, interest rates, the required tax financing, and so on, as they do in general equilibrium, but counterfactually kept the transfer at its steady state level? And just to first order, the total consumption response has to be the sum of those two parts. Now, what the theoretical part, the demand equivalence, is about is going to be a statement on that second part, on those general equilibrium effects. And it's going to be an entirely straightforward and actually very well-known intuition. So say after the deficit finance transfer, households want to consume more. That's just going to put pressure on some notion of an aggregate resource constraint in your economy. Now consider a second shock, an expansion in public spending, so kind of the conventional Keynesian fiscal spending stimulus. That is also going to put pressure on some notion of an aggregate resource constraint. Now, in general equilibrium, maybe interest rates go up and like that pressure is accommodated by crowding out consumption and investment. The output goes up and things are even more crowded in, as in normal Keynesian models. What demand equivalence says is that whatever the GE effect of the transfer policy,
if I can interject here. I think that's clear.
some noise in the background. I don't know if you guys can hear it. Okay, I'll just keep on going. But what demand equivalence is saying is that the GE effects of these two kinds of policies, whatever they may be, should be tied together. And formally, what I'll do is, number one, I'll give a set of restrictions on primitives in my economy for that to exactly be the case, so that indeed these two kinds of shocks or policies share exactly the same general equilibrium effects. And number two is I'll argue that that equivalence is a feature, either an exact or a near exact feature of a relatively large family of popular business cycle models. And my main laboratory is going to be a relatively rich new kind of estimated Hank model. So you can think of it as like Hank meets Metz-Lauders. And I'm going to document that this is an almost exact feature of that particular model. Now that theory is going to be useful because it'll imply a particular measurement strategy. Number one is you look in the cross section and you leverage the fact that what I've defined theoretically to be the direct response is a particular kind of average treatment effect in the treated subpopulation, which is all households. And I'll show that that is actually the estimate of the cross-sectional diff and diff style approaches, and indicates that following transfer receipt, household spending goes up briefly but significantly. And then invoking demand equivalence, I just look at what happens to aggregate consumption after a similarly short-lived and deficit-financed expansion in aggregate government spending. And I know by demand equivalence, this should recover the missing general equilibrium part. And I follow quite closely, say, the recent work of Valerie Ramey, and more or less like her, I find around a unit fiscal multiplier and very little response of private consumption. The immediate implication is that if you write down any model satisfying demand equivalence and calibrate that to match the cross-sectional and the time series evidence, you'll be forced to conclude that aggregate consumption increases briefly but significantly following the transfer, with the amount very similar to what the cross-sectional regression gave you. Or turning things around, if you see some structural analysis that tells you, hey, this missing intercept is far from zero, the cross-sectional estimates are not a good guide, then you know immediately that this analysis is either implicitly imposing a fiscal multiplier far from one, or it's rejecting a relatively large and popular family of structural models that actually feature demand equivalence. Okay, so let me jump into the main part. Again, structure is going to be first the theory and then the measurement implication. So I'll begin with the theory of consumption demand equivalence. Because I'm not really innovating on the model framework is relatively straightforward and well known. I'll just verbally sketch the overall outline, but we can talk about that in more detail later on if you're interested. So what I call this quantitative business cycle model builds on the kind of very familiar Kittlin-Prescott neoclassical RBC core as its structure, and then enriches that with three kinds of frictions or extensions. Number one, as in the New Keynesian business cycle literature, demand determined output and demand determined labor. So a price and a wage New Keynesian Phillips curve. And as such, that model is going to nest kind of the canonical monetary policy, fiscal policy framework in the New Keynesian business cycle literature. Number two, on the household side, I'm going to allow for uninsurable household income risk and potentially binding borrowing constraints. So you're going to get potentially a high average MPC. That's just going to put me into the space of Hank models, like the Kaplan-Morbulante 2018 paper. Number three, this is not really essential for the household stuff I'll be talking about today, but because the paper is about investment, it also has that. There's going to be a relatively general set of real and financial frictions to capital and labor reallocation across firms. So it can speak to this heterogeneous firm investment literature. In terms of solution concept, the rules of the game are going to be that I'll, as kind of most business cycle work, we'll look at the first order perturbation solution. So I'm going to look at small aggregate shocks around the deterministic steady state. And just because it's going to be more convenient for my overall proof strategy, I'm going to look at the equivalent perfect foresight transition path solution. So it's relatively well known by now that for a small aggregate shock, if you look at the perfect foresight transition path, that's just mathematically the same as the first order perturbation. The intuition just being, well, certainty equivalence holds for first order perturbations as by definition for perfect foresight transition paths, and well, both shocks are small, so Taylor's theorem and you're done. Okay, so that's going to be the setup. Now, my objective is going to be to show a particular commonality in what I refer to as general equilibrium effects in the transmission of two kinds of policy. So to establish that, I'll need to say what the two policies are that I'm looking at, or the two shocks, and what I mean by GE effects. So let me begin with the two shocks. The two shocks in my model are going to be, number one, a lump sum transfer paid out to all households. So to fix ideas, think of that as $500 given to all households for one period. And of course, for complete description of a policy, there must be some underlying financing rules. So some deficit financing and either distortionary and non-distortionary taxes at some point rising in the future. Second policy is an aggregate government spending plan. So the government itself commits to consuming some amount of the aggregate final good in my economy. And again, that has to be financed. So there's some underlying financing rule. Okay, now for these two kinds of shocks, I'm going to look at the induced impulse response of consumption, and I'm going to decompose it in a particular way. So first, a bit of notation. Everything you'll see from now on, boldface is going to denote a path. So from T0, when the shock hits, up until the infinite future. Now the boldface C, with a hat, that's the impulse response. So the deviation of consumption from its steady state value. And the subscript S just indicates the shock, either the transfer shock or the fiscal spending shock. And the right-hand side of that equation here is just, well, giving you the definition of what that consumption impulse response is. So aggregating across all households, you can recover an aggregate consumption function. Just households potentially receive the transfer tau and face all kinds of general equilibrium prices or general equilibrium objects more generally, labor demand, wages, interest rates, the taxes that at some point need to be paid to finance the policy. All of that stuff goes into this orange vector PS, and the transfer goes into the green vector tau S. Difference between evaluated at whatever those paths do in general equilibrium versus where they are in steady state forever is my impulse response. Now to first order, you can just additively decompose it into two parts. First part is that I keep all of those price objects, wages, interest rates, the tax financing at steady state, and just change the transfer. That is what I call the partial equilibrium or direct impact of the policy. Second part, the orange part, is the inverse of that, keeping the transfer fixed and changing everything else as it changes in general equilibrium. Now that is just one particular decomposition that I've made up, and I'll document some properties of it, but it's going to be useful because down the line, with how I've defined these objects, I'll be able to link the green object to the estimate of cross-sectional regression studies, and the orange one as something that's already been estimated in the existing time series fiscal policy literature. So the main equivalence result is going to be the following. So I take the basic setup that I just verbally sketched to you in a relatively rich model, nesting, as I said, New Keynesian DSGs, but also relatively rich Hank models, for example. I'm going to be imposing one additional restriction on primitives. That restriction is going to be either one on household preferences, that there are no wealth effects in labor supply, or one on the labor market as a whole, that wages are fully rigid. So households are off the labor supply curve and labor is fully demand determined. And either one of those two restrictions on primitives, the following is going to be the case. So you can give me an arbitrary transfer policy, so what I've sketched a couple of slides ago. Now we know from the decomposition, the response of consumption to that policy, the total impulse response, is equal to the partial equilibrium object plus the general equilibrium object. What the decomposition here is saying is that for every such transfer policy, there's going to exist a particular fiscal spending policy, epsilon G, such that the response of the total response of consumption to that fiscal spending policy is equal precisely to the missing general equilibrium part of the transfer policy. And these two policies have to satisfy two requirements. One is that they lead to identical kind of direct spending demand for that single final good in my economy. So that's kind of the green equation you can see down here, that the C tau hat PE object is exactly equal to what happens to government spending after the fiscal policy expansion. Number two, under all of my restrictions that I've given you so far, it can be shown that these two policies, because they have the same present value, they can in principle be financed using the same path of distortionary or non-distortionary taxes and then over time deficits. I'm imposing that not only can they be financed in that way, they are indeed financed that way. Under those assumptions, you have that decomposition. Now, before I give you a quick intuition for the proof, let me just give you kind of a visual depiction of what that decomposition looks like. And what I've solved here is a very particular Hank model with GHH preferences. So there's a complementarity in consumption and hours worked of households. Now, on the left-hand panel, you can see the response of consumption to the transfer policy. Normalized to increase overall consumption in partial equilibrium, so that direct object, by 1%. And you see, well, there are these high MPCs, but they decay pretty quickly. So the direct response of consumption is larger in impact and then goes down to steady state relatively quickly. The gray line, also on the left-hand side, is the total consumption counterfactual. And you can see that is much, much larger than the direct response, so more than 2 times as big. What's happening there is, well, hours work go up to accommodate that increase in demand, but then consumption demand goes up further, so there's a loop and the overall multiplier is very large. Right-hand side is showing you what happens after an increase in government spending that satisfies these 2 additional restrictions on policy that I had in the previous proposition. You can see by how I've defined things, there is no direct response of consumption to the policy, but there's a very large indirect response, and so a large overall total effect. And well, the content of the proposition is just that the difference between the green and gray line on the left-hand side, the orange line there, is exactly equal to the full response of consumption to the government spending shock. Okay, so that's the content of the proposition. Now as for the intuition. So reason why it works is that you can show in this model, you can characterize the equilibrium as just a very large system of market clearing conditions and prices adjusting to clear those markets. So there's an output market, a labor market, asset markets, and then a bunch of other restrictions, a government budget constraint, arbitrage relations, a Taylor rule, and so on. You can just abstractly write the equilibrium in that way. What that reveals is that kind of by a very simple chain rule intuition, if you have 2 shocks that perturb the same market clearing conditions by the same amount, then they must also induce the same kind of general equilibrium price responses. They must be accommodated in the same way in general equilibrium. And my 3 restrictions, so the 2 features of the policy and the restriction on primitives, are exactly designed to ensure that these 2 policies enter all of these equations in exactly the same way. So first of all, the 2 restrictions on policy. Number 1, well, they are by construction inducing the same path of partial equilibrium net excess demand for the final output good. Number 2, they are entering the government budget constraint in exactly the same way. So they are financed using the same path of deficits and then higher taxes in the future. And number 3, what would happen without my additional restriction is that after receiving the transfer, households would say, okay, I want to consume some of it, but now I'm happier, so I'm going to work less. So there's going to be excess labor demand. The same would not happen after the fiscal spending expansion, because by my assumption, that expansion is not valued or is separately valued by households. Now I'm ruling out this labor supply effect by either saying, hey, households actually don't want to adjust their labor supply. There are no wealth effects in labor supply, or they may want to, but that's irrelevant because labor is demand determined anyway. As it turns out, even in the kind of rich model that I verbally sketched to you guys, that set of restrictions is enough to arrive at the equivalence result. Now what's important to notice what this result gives us, but also what it doesn't tell us. So it does tell us that for what I would argue is a relatively general, interesting family of structural macro models, there's a particular kind of sufficient statistics decomposition. If you're interested in what happens to total consumption after the transfer, if I in those models tell you what happens in terms of a direct consumption response and what happens to consumption after a particular well-chosen fiscal spending expansion, that model has no further wiggle room to give you change what the overall consumption response is to the transfer. That doesn't say though, whether those GE effects are likely to be large or likely to be small, negative, positive. It just justifies a particular empirical measurement strategy. So as I showed you in the slide, a couple of slides ago, there can be kind of hang GHH models in which there's strong amplification. So the orange term is large and positive. If you write down a neoclassical economy, like an RBC model with the spender-saver structures that the transfer does something, what you would see is what you see on the picture here. You again have a large direct consumption response, but then in general equilibrium, a good chunk of that is crowded out because interest rates go up and that crowds out consumption, and then actually output is also falls over time because investment is crowded out. And actually you can also have models in which there's complete offset. So you may have something large in the cross section, but there's an exact zero effect in the time series in general equilibrium overall. So all this demand equivalence will tell us is that to figure out what those effects are, it's going to be useful to look at what happens to consumption after an expansion in fiscal spending. Now, before I do that, though, here's the decomposition again, just to show that, again, it exactly works in that simple model. Now, before I go into implementing that measurement, let me just see how I'm doing on time. I'll hurry up a little bit. The way I'm going to think about the measurement implications that I'll show you in a couple of minutes is that under a particular set of exact exclusion restrictions on my model, so that kind of equilibrium representation, having a bunch of exact zeros in there, I will, through my measurement, be able to construct a valid semi-structural counterfactual. You can think about that a little bit like the structural VAR literature, where we're imposing a bunch of exact zero restrictions, say on impact or in the long run, to figure out what happens to output after demand shock or after a monetary policy shock. Now, you can think about my approach in a similar way. That's imposing some strong exact zero restrictions, but it may be useful to figure out how sensitive it is to violations of those exact exclusion restrictions. Now, the paper walks through a lot of those plausible model perturbations and then kind of applying my method to artificial model generated data and seeing what it would give us. For the purposes of the short talk today, I'll just be focusing my attention on a kind of particular salient restriction, which is the one that I gave you in the model that I just sketched, which is the labor supply restriction. So if we were to drop that, we could nest something like the Hank model or the kind of Smets-Daughter's, Justiniano and Coarth's New Keynesian DSGs. So to figure out how sensitive results are to that particular assumption, what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at a particular kind of relatively rich estimated Hank model. So I've written on a relatively general Hank model and then estimated it on US time series data using an approach similar to the Smets and Daughter's 2007 model. Now, what do you expect to see in that model is precisely because it violates assumption A1, you're going to miss the wealth effects. So by doing my simple adding up, which is going to miss the fact that following the transfer, output is going to, households are going to work less, and that will push down output and consumption. You're going to overstate the total response of consumption to that transfer. By doing the adding up, you're missing the wealth effect. Now, what I show on the left-hand side is at the posterior mode of my estimated Hank model, the total consumption impulse response. That's the gray line. Now, if my restriction A1 was satisfied, then the black line, which is just the sum of these two objects, the partial equilibrium response and the total response of consumption to the fiscal spending expansion, would lie exactly on top of the gray line. Because you have the wealth effect here, you're going to be above it. But the difference, as you can see here at the posterior mode, is very small. And the intuition is not really novel to my paper. It's actually something relatively well known in the New Keynesian business cycle literature, is that at least for relatively short-term perturbations, labor is largely demand determined in the short run via sticky prices and wages. So even though in my model wages are relatively flexible, resetting around every 2.5 quarters, for a shock as short-lived as the one I'm looking at here, that labor supply effect is going to be very small. Now, that is what's happening in my particular model. But really, it's kind of a more general logic, the one I just tried to sketch. And it's, as I document in the paper, a feature of many popular business cycle models that are out there. And just to give you one quick example, solving the Justiniano-Periceri-Tambalotti model at its posterior mode and doing something like my decomposition just there because that model doesn't have hand-to-mouth guys. Now doing not a transfer that doesn't do anything, but doing a kind of impatience shock as a demand wedge. You see, well, the decomposition on the left-hand side, there's very little GE amplification going on in that model, but the adding up is almost exact, just because wages in that model are a lot stickier than in my estimated model. And the paper considers a bunch of other models as well. Finally, what the paper also does, and what maybe we'll have time to talk about later on, is various other plausible perturbations of the baseline model that would break demand equivalence. And what I do in the paper is effectively sign the bias that induces and kind of work out when it's not going to be quantitatively large. All right, so let me just, for the last around 5 minutes or so of the talk, focus on the application of the transfer counterfactual. Let me begin just with a very quick kind of state of the literature. So if you look around at what people have mostly been doing for that is exactly as I said in the introduction, look in the cross section, use lotteries, use the random timing of receipt, use surveys. And what those quite consistently tell you is that at the individual household level, there is a large but short-lived consumption spending response to transfer receipt. Now, as I've argued, that is missing general equilibrium effects, and that's not really my point. If you say, read the Packer, Souleles, and Coarth's 2013 paper, you're going to find a sentence like, while what we estimate are quite substantial PE effects, the ultimate impact on aggregate consumption may be higher or lower due to possible changes in prices or interest rates, or to additional spending through multiplier effects. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to show you that the decomposition I just gave you is a purely theoretical object a couple of slides ago. It's going to have useful measurement implications because with how I've cooked up things, my partial equilibrium effect is the estimate of precisely those cross-sectional diff and diff star regressions. And then I'm going to look in the time series and try to figure out what happens to consumption after particular fiscal spending expansions. Now, first part is really quite straightforward, so I'll be quick. What I've defined to be the direct response is just pretty much average of household level MPCs. So here that's a path, so it's an MPC on impact as well as dynamic MPCs, or IMPCs in the language of Auclair and co-authors. And what that kind of cross-sectional approach gives us in terms of these objects is a large, as I've mentioned, large but short-lived overall spending response. And I'm going to take the point estimates of the Parker and co-authors 2013 paper, which kind of give a large impact response, is still relatively sizable 1/4 delayed response, and then it's pretty much back to zero. So that I'm going to take as my path of the overall direct response of consumption to the transfer. So now we get to the interesting part, which is the missing intercept. So my second identifying assumption is going to be, I will for now exactly impose demand equivalence. So by imposing that directly, I know that to figure out what the cross-sectional regression is missing, I need to look at what happens to aggregate consumption after a fiscal spending expansion that is as short-lived as the increase in household spending that I just documented in the cross-section. And then in terms of interpretation, whatever my fiscal policy, VAR, local projection, time series experiment will give me in terms of the underlying financing will also be the financing that I'm implicitly imposing is going on for the transfer that I'm interested in. So my precise implementation is going to closely follow Valerie Ramey in a 2011 QJE paper, and I think QJE, and then in a more recent literature review, which is effectively to treat government spending professional forecast errors as what's known as a macro IV or a proxy variable. And then following some of my other work with Mikkel, Blackberg, Möller, I'm going to order that first in a recursive VAR and so effectively project on it. Now, what this gives me, what's kind of well known, is this gives me a very short-lived expansion in aggregate government spending. And that is an expansion that is persistently deficit financed. So the deficit goes up immediately, stays elevated for a couple of years, and distortionary labor taxes go up with a couple of year delay. So that's going to be how my counterfactual for transfers is supposed to be interpreted. Now, the key observation is that what happens to consumption after that particular spending policy? Well, what happens is that output goes more or less up dollar for dollar with the increase in fiscal spending, and consumption, there's somewhat of a mild undershoot. So there's little response on impact, then somewhat of an undershoot below steady state, and then very quickly a return to baseline. So that's going to be my estimate. And now you know, if you were to write down any model satisfying demand equivalence, and you were to match that time series evidence, as well as to match the cross-sectional evidence I just gave you a slide ago, you'd arrive at the following conclusion. You just take your two paths and you sum them point by point. And that's what I'm doing here. And what you see is that the overall consumption response, here the black line with the orange shaded macro confidence bands, is going to be very close to whatever the direct micro diff and diff estimates gave you. They're not the right object to look at conceptually, but here they turn out to be a reasonably reliable guide to the full macro counterfactual. Now, that part I already mentioned, but again, as I said in the intro, turning things around, if you see a structural analysis that arrives at a different conclusion, you know that either it's implicitly imposing a fiscal multiplier far from 1, which is the number that's usually estimated in the time series, or that model is in some way different from a relatively large and popular family of macro models in which these two kinds of demand shocks are very closely tied together in overall general equilibrium. All right, so let me just very quickly conclude. So what I've hoped to convince you of is that this idea of demand equivalence, which seems to be a feature of an important family of macro models, has useful empirical measurement implications. So number one, I've just worked out what these cross-sectional regressions give you is interpretable as a very particular kind of direct response. And under some stronger restrictions, those of demand equivalence, existing fiscal policy time series experiments can actually tell us about the general equilibrium part that these cross-sectional regressions are missing. In the talk today was all about applying that logic to an income tax rebate stimulus, just because that's a very kind of salient policy in that overall Hank literature that I'm relating to. But what you'll see in the paper is that, number one, on the theory side, it's very straightforward to see that all of the theory is going to extend without change to generic shifters of consumption demand, and the paper has an application to redistribution across households. But second part, and a little bit less obviously, there's also a set of restrictions that give you an analogous equivalence result for investment demand. And the paper has an application to investment tax stimulus. All right, that's all from me. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Christian. Yeah, very interesting paper, and obviously, for those of us that like applied work, this is sort of important toolbox to get there. So let me just ask the first question. Remind the audience that if you have questions, use the Q&A. But so I'm thinking about, I mean, there's quite a lot of papers on the fiscal multiplier that sort of use cross-sectional data, either cross-state or other measures. And many of those, like cross-state, that use Bartik or different diff kind of techniques, they tend to find quite large spending multipliers relative to, for example, what you do in the, if you use instruments and use panels or aggregate time series. So how should I? Do you think that's because there these the demand equivalence is broken?
So the way I think about those estimates is that, I mean, they are theoretically giving you a different kind of object from what the time series estimates are after, for mainly reasons. Number one is that by looking across regions, you are differencing out anything that is common at the aggregate macroeconomic level, in particular interest rate changes. So these, while not exactly, are more related to something like a zero lower bound multiplier. Number two is by looking across regions, they are also kind of, they contain in them a particular notion of general equilibrium effects. They are containing local general equilibrium effects because they're usually at the state level, but they're not containing further G stuff that is happening across regions, right? So those two are reasons for why they're not actually giving you something interpretable as a full fiscal policy counterfactual. If time series macro counterfactual, if you were to brush aside those two concerns, say by saying, I want to be explicitly in the ZLB environment, and I believe that these regional things are not particularly important, then I think these are actually a very useful number to use as an input to the results that I'm presenting. So what I'm doing in my application so far is I say whatever you observe as the kind of underlying environment of your fiscal policy estimates, those will also be how you should interpret your counterfactual for the transfer. And as you say, most of those time series estimates are coming from pre-ZLB periods. If you do that at the ZLB in the time series, or if you believe your cross-sectional estimates there, they tend to be larger. And all my theory is then saying immediately that, you know, whatever you get in terms of transfer estimates in the cross-section is now going to be an underestimate because you have large positive multipliers. So I'm not wedded to any particular point estimate in terms of the methodology overall. I just presented the one for a particular macro environment where I think the literature is like most consistent on the fiscal policy side.
It's interesting, yeah. So I guess the other thing that may happen sometimes is, I guess, if you think about this in terms of sort of using different diff, is maybe if the sort of defining who is in the treatment group and who's in the control group, if that responds to the policy itself, then I guess that's would be another.
Yes, for sure. So that is then going to be a challenge in the interpretation of your first step cross-sectional estimates, right? Say you're interested in a transfer that is given out to everyone, but you for some reason in your cross-section, you only look at a subsample of lottery winners who have some systematically different features from the rest of the population. Maybe, I don't know, right? Then whatever you would get out of my approach would be interpretable as the counterfactual for a transfer given to that subpopulation of lottery winners, which is not really the object that you're interested in, right? But I think, that's a challenge that applies in any way already to the first step estimation of any cross-sectional work you're going to see.
I have a question from the Weikui who's asking about, can you say something about what will happen if government bonds have a lower rate than the mortgage rate or the corporate bond rate?
Yes. So the paper has a pretty long discussion of the fact that for the exact result, and I think that is where he's coming from in his question, is that I'm imposing that they're both borrowing at exactly the same rate, because then the two policies have the same present value, right? And then you can in fact finance them using the same path of transfers or taxes. Now, what would happen if there's a wedge in those borrowing rates? And in particular, say if households, I don't know, implicitly earn a much higher return because they're investing in stocks, or they're paying down very high return mortgage rates. Then it's actually more efficient in terms of kind of the overall bang for buck in terms of the output response to give the money to households, because they have effectively access to a more efficient savings technology, right? So the underlying increase in taxes is going to be smaller, the one needed for the transfer, than the one for the equally large expansion in aggregate government spending. So in that case, what I'm getting would actually be an upper bound, because I am, would actually be a lower bound, my estimate, because I am now imposing a financing that is too stringent. I'm raising taxes too much. You wouldn't be needing to raise them as much for the transfer counterfactual. And in the paper I work out kind of gives some back of the envelope intuition and then more structural work of why that effect, I mean, is there, it's visible, but it's difficult to get it to be very large. I mean, right. Just maybe very quickly, if you have like an overall spending expansion of $100, and even if you have like an annual difference in interest rates of 2-3 percentage points, that's $2-3 over the year overall, that then map into different consumption, into different taxes underlying it in terms of the financing. That's visible, but it's not huge relative to the overall impulse in spending that you see.
Another question from Anton Nakov from the ECB is, how would your results be affected if pricing or weight setting were state dependent?
That is not an issue in the following sense. So everything I presented to you today was around a perfect foresight transition path around the deterministic steady state. So, and as such is interpreted as the usual kind of first order perturbation, but you can also interpret the result as a perturbation around any arbitrary transition path. So you could have some distribution, yeah, and you would just look around what that initial path, what that initial starting point is. And again, you would need to impose that what you observe in the time series is applicable to that particular initial state that you're interested in. And also in terms of kind of what the overall precise nature of the price stickiness is, I kind of gave you a very specific structural model to kind of anchor overall understanding of the family of models that I'm working with, and I just picked the most familiar one. But if you look at this kind of general semi-structural equilibrium representation that I gave you, this just general formula, right, which has a bunch of zeros in it needed for the equivalence of the two shocks, you can see immediately that this is not really tied to, say, the process of expectation formation, the precise preferences. I mean, I'm just assuming something very particular for like the audience to be more familiar with how the overall setup is working. But what's really needed is kind of the single good restriction, the common interest rate financing, and kind of that government spending there is entering household preference in a particular separable way or not at all. Those are kind of the key restrictions that you cannot relax if you want to map into that semi-structure. Something like state dependence in price or wage setting is largely orthogonal to what I'm doing.
So another question from Frank Potier is, so if you look at your analysis of sort of what is coming out, and you find this in the data, basically you conclude there's no G effect from the transfer shock. So Frank is asking, well, so should that mean then when I write down a model, that should be a property I should impose on any model I would write down then?
Well, I would say if you're writing down a model that satisfies demand equivalence, as I would argue most models so far have done, yeah, then if your model is such that it has strong general equilibrium effects, then you are implicitly imposing that the fiscal multiplier is far from 1. And I mean, that is just going to be a feature of your model. And I would argue that is a feature that is arguably inconsistent with most of the time series evidence that both my own analysis has yielded, as well as what my understanding of the literature would give you. So, I mean, I think it's fine if you want to disagree with that, but then now kind of what this paper gives you as the tools is it says, like, you need to be explicit about why you're disagreeing with it. Are you disagreeing because you think there's a quantitatively important deviation from demand equivalence, and that's going to be a feature of your model that you should highlight, because most of our models don't have that? Or you believe that the fiscal policy kind of time series literature is, you just don't believe those point estimates. Maybe you really like the cross-sectional state estimates and you're willing to say, I'm only interested in ZLB counterfactuals. So then you want to target a multiplier around 1.7, 1.8, which is what Shadora Reich and co-authors usually find.
Okay, I think we have time for the last one here. So there's a question from Roine Westman asking how your paper relates to the Guren, Nakamura, McKay, Steinson paper.
Yeah. So these two papers are very closely related. And yeah, so in terms of the overall application of it, the obvious difference between the two is that Nakamura-Steinson paper has a different objective. It's looking at a cross-sectional, like a cross-state estimate. And that one, as I mentioned a couple of minutes ago, has in it local general equilibrium effects. And they are trying to strip those out. So they're using local fiscal multiplier estimate to strip out the local GE part and get at what I've defined to be the partial equilibrium part. My entire setup or the objective is different in the sense that I am looking at what I already assume to have as a partial equilibrium object, and I'm aggregating it up to a full general equilibrium counterfactual. Now that's the difference in the application. Difference in the overall idea that fiscal spending multipliers can teach you about some notion of G effects is exactly the same. And just as a final point, where in the more than model-driven analysis the papers differ is kind of what I try to do is I say, how sensitive is that result to violations of the underlying assumptions? In which directions are we going to be biased? But also in particular document that it is in fact a feature of most models we've written down so far.
Okay, I think we are sort of running 10 minutes late, so I think we should probably have a coffee break now and be back at 15:40 for the next presentation, which is Karin Kinnerud. Yeah, so let's all stretch our legs, and I'll be back in 10 minutes. Thanks a lot, Christian.
Hello, welcome back. Great, welcome back. So my name is Emiliano Santoro from the University of Copenhagen, and in this session we'll be having the presentations of Karin Kinnerud from BI Norwegian Business School and Martin de Ridder from the London School of Economics. Let me just remind you the ground rules. Everybody's audio and video is muted, and you cannot change these unless we will unmute you without prior consent. You can ask questions via the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And I'll be selecting questions to be posed to the speaker at the end of the talk. And presenters will in any case receive all of your questions after the presentation. So for those whose question wasn't posed in the previous session, don't worry, we'll be forwarding your questions to the speakers. And in any case, you will have the chance to interact with them through the link that Morten has posted in the chat. So please do not use the chat, but only the Q&A facility. So I'll be giving the floor to Karin. You have 30 minutes, and then we'll be having the Q&A session, please.
Thank you. Let's see here. I hope you now see my slides. Thank you very much for putting my paper on this schedule. I'm happy to present my paper on monetary policy and the mortgage market. So ever since the Great Recession, there has been an increased focus on mortgage and housing markets among policymakers, and in particular among central bankers. And it's not strange to think that mortgage and housing markets could be very important for monetary policy, as mortgage and housing choices are among the largest and most important financial choices for most households. And there's a growing empirical literature that should suggest that households' exposures to changes in mortgage interest rates matter for monetary policy. And more specifically, they find that households who experience changes in their mortgage payments as a result of monetary policy tend to respond stronger in their consumption. And this literature also finds that house prices tend to respond stronger to monetary policy when mortgage markets are more flexible. And with flexible here, I have in mind both that mortgages tend to have more flexible rates or adjustable rates, and also that refinancing is available. And in traditional models of monetary policy, housing and mortgage markets are often not included. So what I ask in this paper is, what role do mortgages and housing play in the transmission of monetary policy? And more specifically, how do changes in mortgage interest rates and house prices affect aggregate demand? And I also take a look at if aggregate responses depend on the mortgage contract specification. And here you can think that I include a stickiness in financial contracts and compare to economies where either all mortgages have fixed rates or adjustable rates. And the way I go about to answer these questions is that I use heterogeneous agent life cycle model, where I trace out aggregate consumption demand as a function of a real interest rate path. And obviously mortgage and housing markets are modeled in great detail, since this is the focus of the paper. And markets are incomplete in the sense that households cannot fully insure against earnings risk. And importantly, housing equity is illiquid. So given these two features, the model is able to produce households that are so-called wealthy hand to mouth. Since the housing equity is illiquid, there are households who have a lot of wealth invested in housing, but still quite low levels of liquid savings. And since I also model both housing and mortgages, the gross balances of these assets, the model can also produce relatively poor households that have very large exposures to interest rate changes. So what I have, the households I have in mind are households who are homeowners, so they're relatively wealthy, but they have large mortgage balances. So they're not that wealthy, but the mortgage balances exposes them to changes in the interest rate. And to analyze effects of changes in mortgage interest rates and cash flow effects from changes in mortgage interest rates, it's important that the model can capture a realistic distribution of how constrained households are. So and ways to measure this or to consider how many constrained households there are is to look at the distributions of both leverage and liquid assets. And also something we see in data is that there's a negative correlation between household leverage and liquid assets. And this is something that my model can speak to. And the focus of this paper is really to look at the direct effects of a change in the real interest rate on aggregate demand. So I focus on the mechanisms on the demand side through how different cash flow effects affect different households differently. And I also look at choices in the mortgage and housing markets. And as I mentioned, I study the importance of the mortgage contract specification. And I include or I model a general equilibrium in the housing market, since direct effects can be influenced by how house prices change. And since asset prices tend to respond very quickly to changes in their environment, these can be important also for these direct effects. But let me also be clear about what I do not include in the model. So I do not study general equilibrium effects in, for example, the labor market or price setting by firms. The model is completely real. But I do include a robustness analysis in terms of the general equilibrium effects in the labor market. So I include an empirically estimated path of aggregate income to see if the direct effects are influenced by this. And I find that that's my analysis is quite robust to this. And to include how demand effects would play out in general equilibrium is relatively straightforward, but would clearly depend on how you model this. And at the heart of this analysis is how different households are affected. And that was mentioned in earlier presentations. It's likely the case that households are affected very differently by general equilibrium effects. So one would want to take that very seriously if modeling it fully. So a preview of my findings. So I find that changes in mortgage interest rates and house prices amplify the response in aggregate consumption to an expansionary monetary policy shock. And this amplification is mostly driven by constrained homeowners who use cash out refinancing to smooth consumption. So what's going on is that the real rate goes down. This drives down mortgage interest rates and house prices increase. So for households who have relatively low liquidity can take this opportunity to use cash out refinancing to access their housing equity. And these households are constrained either through poor earnings realization or just the fact that they are relatively young and expect better times in the future or higher earnings in the future, and therefore find it optimal to substantially increase consumption today by refinancing. And I also find that renters, there's some renters who postpone their house purchase due to higher house prices. And when they do so, they become less constrained in their spending because they don't have to pay the transaction costs in the housing market. And therefore, they also increase consumption today. And when I compare the setting where mortgages have fixed rates to a setting where mortgages instead have adjustable rates, house prices increase substantially more, and the aggregate consumption response is more than 6 times as large. So the mortgage contract really seemed to matter substantially. So let me briefly go over the model. So as I mentioned, I use this heterogeneous agent incomplete markets lifecycle model, and I investigate how consumers respond to a real interest rate shock. And in the model, households maximize utility by choosing how much to consume, to rent or own a house, the house size, the mortgage size, and any liquid savings. In terms of the housing market, the aggregate housing stock is fixed, but it's divisible between owner and rental housing. And since I focus on these direct effects, I find this assumption of fixed aggregate housing supply fairly reasonable. And house prices adjust to clear the housing market. There are transaction costs when both buying and selling a house, so this contributes to this illiquid nature of owned housing. In terms of the mortgage market, in the baseline economy, I model the mortgage contract as a 30-year fixed payment mortgage. So this is the most commonly used type in the US. And then I compare this to a setting with a 30-year mortgage contract, but with an adjustable rate instead. And a household can refinance their mortgage, but you don't have to pay a fixed refinancing cost and also cost proportional to the mortgage that you take up. I include two common constraints in the mortgage market. So there's a down payment or a loan to value requirement and a payment to income requirement. And these need to be fulfilled whenever you take up a new mortgage, either when buying a house or when refinancing your existing mortgage. And the house will live for at most 60 years. And there's an age-dependent probability of surviving to each next period. And the earnings process is completely exogenous and consists of a deterministic trend that captures this hump-shaped life cycle profile of earnings. And there are permanent and transitory earnings shocks. I also include the possibility to itemize deductions where households can deduct their mortgage interest payments from their earnings before paying earnings taxes. And the earnings tax is progressive. So what this does is that it's more favorable for high-income households to have mortgages, which is the case in the US tax code. And households derive utility from CRA preferences with the Cobb-Douglas aggregator over consumption and housing services S. And then there's a parameter EJ capturing, it's a age-dependent utility shifter that captures that household size tend to change over the life cycle. I also include a warm glow bequest motif over net worth Q, and I model bequests as a luxury good. In terms of the rental market, it's modeled fairly simplistically. I assume the rental housing is owned by foreign investors, and the rental rate is just given by a simple user cost formula, where for the investors earn the after-tax return on liquid bonds on their rental investments after paying property taxes and maintenance costs. And the government is included in the model to tax the household and provide social security to retirees. And the government also collects the bequests and distributes some of these to the newborn population to match the asset distribution of young households in data. And overall, the government runs a surplus that it spends wastefully. So to the calibration, so there's a large set of parameters that are measured directly in data. And there are 10 parameters that I calibrate jointly through a simulated method of moments. And these, the moments I target are related to housing and debt. So for example, the home ownership rate, housing wealth to earnings, the median loan to value in the economy, and also to capture the frictions in the housing market, I calibrate the refinancing cost to match the prevalence of refinancing that we see in data. And to give you a sense of or how the model does in terms of life cycle profiles, these are moments that are partly targeted. So I target the overall median LTV in the economy, for example. But here you also see that the model does fairly well in terms of capturing these characteristic life cycle profiles of high debt early on in life that households tend to pay off. And it does well in terms of house to earnings over the life cycle as well. But I do clearly overestimate the home ownership rate among the middle-aged household and underestimate it for the older households. So clearly these variables or debt levels and housing are important for my results. But what's also very important is that the model can capture the extent to which households are constrained in their spending.
So next, let me show you to the left here, the distribution of liquid assets to earnings in the lower parts of the distribution. So here you see that there's quite a substantial or quite a lot of households that have low liquid savings, both in data and in the model. And the gray line is just indicating a threshold that is often used to proxy for if a household is hand to mouth. So if you have liquid asset to earnings of less than 0.5, you would be considered so-called hand-to-mouth household. And if we look at the table, you can see that the share of hand-to-mouth households by using this proxy is about 38% in data and 24% in the model. But what you can also see is that among the homeowners in the model, it matches very well data in terms of the share of households with low liquid savings. But on the flip side, the model does not do so well in terms of matching the share of poor hand-to-mouth or the very poor renters. And I guess this is common in these models, that it's hard to generate enough households that have almost none or no savings. And as I mentioned in the introduction, we can see in data that there's a negative correlation between debt and liquid savings. And this pattern, the model is also able to capture fairly well. So we see that with LTV here on the x-axis, that households that are highly in debt tend to also have fairly low levels of liquid savings. So that's also an indicator of the type of households that are fairly constrained in their spending. Okay, so let me move on to the results. So the main experiment that I do is a shock to the real interest rate. And I start from a steady state with an invariant distribution over households, and then I compute nonlinear impulse response functions to a probability 0 MIT type shock to the real interest rate, assuming perfect foresight. So as already motivated well in the previous presentation, I use this Bobart-Krusell-Mittman that they've shown that you can use these to proxy for a linearized solution to a model with aggregate risk. And the interest rate shock that I consider is a shock that is empirically estimated. It's an empirically estimated path of the real interest rate from Auclair et al. And then I use a 100 basis point expansionary monetary policy shock. So in the figure, you see the path of the bond rate in blue. So the empirically estimated path from a 100 basis point nominal shock directly translates into about 80 basis point cut in the real rate. And in terms of mortgage interest rates, the adjustable rate contract, I assume a constant credit spread. So the short-term mortgage rate of the adjustable rate contracts follows closely the interest rate on bonds, but you read it off on the right-hand side, so it has the constant credit spread. And in terms of the fixed rate mortgages, the mortgage interest rate is a 30-year mortgage interest rate. And here I just use the expectations hypothesis that the long-term mortgage interest rate is just given by the geometric mean of the periodic mortgage interest rates. And as you can see, the long-term mortgage interest rate responds very little to this also short-term shock to the interest rate. So the main differences between these two contracts are that clearly the adjustable rate contract, the mortgage rate responds much more in the short term. But it's also the case that when a contract have adjustable rates, then all households with mortgages are affected by the change in the interest rate, whereas under the fixed rate contract, only those who take up new mortgages or refinance their mortgage would realize this change in the contract rate. So to my main findings. So here I show you the impulse response function of consumption. And as you can see, there's a significantly stronger response under the adjustable rate contract regime. And this is consistent with the empirical findings in, for example, Kalsa et al. And as you can see, there's also a sharp decline following the initial increase, which is most obvious maybe under the fixed rate contract. And this is mostly coming from intertemporal substitution, but also from the fact that I keep aggregate income fixed in this analysis. So when I do my robustness analysis, where I just include an empirically estimated response in aggregate income, you don't see this negative drop afterwards. It is more smoothed down. Okay, so, and since the focus of this paper is on the direct effects, I'm going to now zoom in on what's going on here in the period of the interest rate shock. So here I show you decomposition of the consumption responses among 4 different groups of households: those who buy a house, those who refinance their mortgage, those who stay in their house and follow the amortization plan, and those who rent. And under the fixed rate, I also perform a decompositional exercise where under the fixed rate mortgage here, I show you the first row is what I showed in the previous slide. I let house prices and mortgage interest rate change, but I also compute the IRFs for when I keep these prices fixed. And first you can see that in the overall effect, there's an amplification when you let both house prices and mortgage interest rate adjust. So the mortgage interest rate goes down and house prices increase in equilibrium. And this amplification is coming mostly from refinancing households who tend to be fairly constrained households who are in need of liquidity. So then when they want to increase consumption, they have the opportunity to do so by cashing out housing equity or accessing their housing equity. And when mortgage interest rates go down and house prices go up, the possibility for them to cash out housing equity increases, and they can therefore increase consumption more. And these households tend to be, as I mentioned earlier, either households who have a transitory low realization of income, or households that are fairly young, so they're on the upward sloping path of their earnings profile. So they expect better times tomorrow, and for that reason also would like to consume more today. And when the mortgage interest rate changes and the house prices change, they get an opportunity to do this. And you can also see that house buyers tend to respond stronger when prices adjust, and also renters. And this is mainly coming from that when prices increase, some house buyers refrain from buying. And when they do so, the average response among buyers is higher because it's the most sort of liquidity constrained buyers that no longer buy. And these buyers, or the households who refrain from buying, end up being renters instead. And when they rent, they don't have to pay the transaction cost of buying, and therefore can consume more today. And when we take a look at the economy when the mortgage contract is of the adjustable rate type instead, we see a very similar pattern. So you see that the overall amplification is much stronger. And it's also the case that when you only let the mortgage interest rate adjust but keep house prices fixed, there's also substantial amplification just from the fact that the mortgage interest rate goes down so much in the short term. And again, we see that refinancing households respond the strongest. And it's also the case that households who buy a house and renters also respond stronger when prices adjust. So overall, I conclude that it's the interaction of lower mortgage interest rate and house prices that are really important in both settings. They lead to this overall amplification. And this amplification is driven by constrained homeowners who use cash out refinancing to smooth consumption. And also in the case of the adjustable rate setting, there are some homeowners who, instead of refinancing their mortgage, they choose to re-optimize their housing choice and move to a new house to access their housing equity. So that contributes also to the stronger response among house buyers in the adjustable rate economy. And as I mentioned, some renters postpone buying a house when house prices increase, and this also contributes to the stronger response when letting these prices adjust. So I think I have a little bit time to show you how this would look if I would also include a response in aggregate income. So I just use an empirically estimated path from the same paper that I take the path of the real interest rate from, and then I feed this to the model. So there are two major caveats of this. So I assume that everyone's labor income are affected in exactly the same way. And this aggregate income response is the same under both the fixed rate contract structure as well as the adjustable rate contract structure. And what my main results are showing or indicating is that the direct demand effects are much stronger under adjustable rate mortgages. So it's likely that this response would also be stronger in this case. And this is taken from estimated in US data where most households use fixed rate mortgages. So it would be more consistent with that setting. And here we see the consumption responses. So the decline is almost gone in terms of the fixed rate mortgage and looks maybe a bit more like we would expect it. But it's still the case that there are large differences between the adjustable rate contract structure and the fixed rate contract structure. And we would probably expect even bigger differences if I would have an empirically estimated path in a setting where contracts are of the adjustable rate type. And the main results are also overall consistent. The mechanisms are the same. It's the refinancing households, the house buyers, and the renters who respond strongly. And the reason for why these mechanisms still remain when including a response in aggregate income is that the amplification is driven by constrained households who expect higher earnings in the future. And when you then include this response in aggregate income that tends to evolve over time, it still incentivizes these households to increase consumption today because now their future looks even brighter. Okay, so here, these were the average responses among households in the first period when the interest rate shock occurs. So let me also show you how the behavior or how the share of refinancers changes over time. So here you see that under the adjustable rate mortgage contract, the share of refinancers increased substantially in the period of the shock. And this is true even though all mortgagers experience the change in the interest rate. You don't have to refinance to capture that, but they refinance in order to cash out housing equity in order to increase consumption today. And in terms of the savings behavior, there are quite large differences in these two settings. So under the fixed rate mortgage contract setting, savings in liquid bonds decline in order to finance this increase in consumption. But under the adjustable rate contract structure, liquid savings actually increase in response to this expansionary shock. But this happens at the same time as there are changes in aggregate mortgage balances. So we see that the aggregate mortgage balance increases when contracts are of the adjustable rate type. So the dissaving is mainly occurring through mortgages. Whereas under the fixed rate mortgage structure, it becomes more favorable to save by paying off your mortgage, as the difference between the mortgage interest rate on this fixed rate contract and the return on liquid savings is the largest when the shock occurs. And for many households with mortgages, they can keep saving on the interest rate that they have on their contract as long as they don't refinance or take up a new mortgage. And then that rate is significantly higher than the rate on the temporary lower rate on liquid savings. And in terms of the equilibrium house price, I find significantly stronger responses in house prices when contracts are of the variable rate type. And this is consistent with empirical findings. And it follows from that the marginal buyers value the lower short-term mortgage rate significantly higher than the lower for long type of mortgage rate under the fixed rate regime. And this also follows from that the contract is a 30-year contract, which you pay off over time. So of course it's more favorable, or you prefer to have a lower rate early on when your mortgage balance is large as compared to later on when you paid some of that down. And in particular for young households that we saw in the calibration section, it tends to be the young households who are the marginal buyers and who also take up rather large mortgages. And since they are on that upward sloping part of the earnings life cycle earnings profile, they're also quite constrained by this amortization schedule of the mortgage and benefit a lot from this lower rate early on. And as I mentioned, this higher house price allows for larger cash outs among refinancing households. So to conclude, I used this heterogeneous household lifecycle model with the detailed modeling of US housing and mortgage markets, and find that the interaction of changes in mortgage interest rates and house prices leads to an amplification in the response in aggregate consumption to the shock to the real interest rate. And the amplification is driven by constrained homeowners who take up a new mortgage to smooth consumption and increase consumption today. And when mortgages have adjustable rates instead of the fixed rate contract, the aggregate response is more than 6 times as large. And half of this amplification comes from just the lower mortgage interest rate on its own. And the remaining half comes from an interaction of both the lower mortgage interest rate and higher house price. So I conclude that mortgage market specifications matter greatly for the transmission of monetary policy. And it's something we should keep in mind when including maybe a one-period debt in our models, that it can have fairly strong implications on how households respond to shocks compared to if the contracts are of the longer fixed rate type. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Karin. So let me reiterate that the Q&A facility is the right place where to post your questions. I have a question myself. Well, you made very clear that what the spirit of the paper is and your modeling choice. Nevertheless, well, I feel compelled to ask you. So, if you were to include consumption goods price stickiness, a number of channels would probably be activated and/or modified. Okay, most probably the response of the house price, which is defined in terms of a relative, well, is defined in terms of consumption goods price. So would there still be a major difference between fixed rate mortgages and adjustable rate mortgages?
Could you clarify a bit what you
let me make an example.
Would be very different? Yeah.
So, well, assume that you have a rate of, well, that you have a supply side and a rate of inflation, and you shock the nominal interest rate. In a nominal rate mortgage environment, the mortgage rate wouldn't be allowed to vary, but the real rate, the corresponding real rate, would vary because of movements in inflation.
Mm-hmm.
So whereas in this setting, you're shocking the real rate of inflation, the real interest rate, sorry. So how would things change in this case? Another potential example is if you have a monetary expansion and the inflation rate goes down, this would probably have an impact on the house price as well, which is defined in terms of consumption goods prices. So how would things change in this case? Because the kind of environment I have in mind is the one of the paper by Kalsa et al., where they have price stickiness.
Mm-hmm.
And yet many of the channels you highlight are present, but probably price stickiness plays an important role.
I mean, I think in the very short term, it's not so important. It's really the real rate that matters for households. And under the adjustable rate, you would see the real adjustable rate, or you would have a real effect on mortgage interest rates. And in the fixed rate contract structure, do you mean that we expect higher inflation? Well, in terms of like what matters for households, I don't see how that would be so different.
They will probably attenuate the increase in the house price.
That could be. Yes, of course, since it's a nominal price. But yeah, in that case, I guess we would see even stronger amplification. And then in terms of how that would be different if they're fixed rate or adjustable rate contracts, I'm not exactly sure how that would affect the house prices differently. So I don't think I have an answer to how that would potentially influence the comparison of these two settings. But I think for now, what I have, what I think is what I missed the most by not having a nominal model is this transfer between debtors and creditors that is well known and has been shown in many papers, and that of course I'm not allowed or able to capture.
Right. Well, thank you. I think that Morten has a question.
Yeah, no, very interesting paper. Yeah, so I was wondering about a couple of things. So no, so the first one is that when you show these impulse responses, I would have expected that in a model like yours, these would sort of potentially depend a lot on the initial conditions. So imagine you have a nice run of shocks before you have a monetary policy shock. So loads of people are loaded up on mortgages. Then you have quite different effects than you would have if you came from the steady state, something like the stationary distribution.
No, that's true. It's been highlighted in a couple of papers, like by Eichenbaum et al. And Berger et al. So I think that's for sure true. So I'm just now in this paper capturing sort of a steady state in my calibration, and then I go from there. But it's true that that probably matters, the path that has led up to where we are today, both in terms of what the interest rate has been and how if it has changed a lot. You could also imagine that the path of the house price could also be important. Yeah. So that would be interesting to look more into how dependent on that it is. So this is just, for now, it's just taking more of a steady state starting point, but that's for sure true.
But I was also wondering about so I guess those that own the mortgages, yeah, I actually missed that. Are the retired people, or
if they are
who has purchased the mortgages?
I do not explicitly model that, so I do not capture that there's a potential, loss by the stakeholders of the banks.
That would seem to me that could potentially be important, no? Because so if those holding the mortgages then receive lower interest income, that could happen even on the fixed if there's a lot of refinancing going on. But because those guys may have high MPCs, of course you have the warm glow that may alleviate that issue, but otherwise.
There's not so many high MPCs retirees in the model, but the way I've thought about it is that banks, of course, always have the possibility to hedge interest rate risk. So even if, it's not necessarily the case that the owners of the banks will experience this change in the interest rate, if you consider that banks can trade with the rest of the world and they can choose whatever interest rate risk exposure that they want. So therefore, I find it more likely that changes in interest rate will affect or households that are liquidity constrained will respond more to this change in the interest rate.
Let me, if I can, report you a question from the audience. So Robert Taylor is asking, the path for the real interest rate shock struck me as possible but contestable. I wonder if the shock lasted longer, so that the long-term rate moved more, your answers would differ. Relatively, it surprises me that house prices move as much as they do for a temporary shock.
Okay. No, that could. I just took it from this paper, but it's straightforward to include a different type of shock. I mean, you could think about the period we've had now with quantitative easing, where longer rates have been influenced and forward guidance. So you would consider maybe some shocks that would be more persistent, and it would be straightforward to analyze, but it's not something I've done yet. But it's likely the case that the two markets would then be a bit more, the responses would be a bit more similar. In terms of the house price response, I think it's not too, it wouldn't, like it seems to me reasonable given the magnitudes that you find in, for example, Kals et al. But it's in that paper, they, of course, you don't have these extreme settings where you have a country with a completely fixed rate mortgage structure or a completely adjustable rate. You compare sort of regions that are more or less the other one, or one or the other. So given that, I think that the responses don't seem too large, but
okay.
Yeah.
Well, actually, I will report this question as the very last one from Carlos Garriga, also because one of our panelists had a question which is somewhat related. So you are discounting cash flow at a lower rate. It is not surprising that prices increase. The situation with fixed prices is good approximation for areas where prices are determined by construction costs. It's more a comment than a question.
Okay. Okay.
Well, relatedly, probably I will let Soren Holraun go ahead with this question, which is the very last one. Soren.
Sure. Thanks for a very interesting talk. Now, I was wondering a little bit also about how house prices are determined in this type of model. So there's been some work in, well, representative agent style models or models with few agents, including the recent paper by Carlos Garriga and co-authors on the AR and even previous work, suggesting that house prices are typically determined, at least in those types of models, by some deep-pocketed housing investor. And I'm wondering how that would translate into your Hank setup. How are house prices determined in the type of model that you are working with here?
I'm not exactly sure how that would translate into this. So in my setting, the housing stock is just fixed, and then the price is given by where demand equals supply in each period.
So house prices are affected by credit-constrained households?
Yes, that's true. Like the marginal buyers tend to be, many of them are at their borrowing constraint. Yeah.
Right, thanks.
Right, so thanks very much, Karin. I would give the floor to Martin the Reader from LSE.
Yeah, do you know how I can share my screen? I don't see the button. Maybe the previous screen is still shared.
No, it's not shared anymore.
Wait, here it is. Here it is.
Should be. Got it. Great.
Yeah. All right. Thanks a lot for the invitation and for the chance to present here. I really enjoyed the other talks. So this is a paper that tries to reconcile three macro trends that, at least before COVID, received a lot of attention both in policy and academia. The first one is that there's been a marked slowdown in the growth rate of productivity. Historically, in the US, for example, productivity growth was around 1.5% per year, but for the last 15 years, growth has been less than 0.5% per year. And that's despite the fact that the type of investments that go into productivity growth, such as research and development, have actually increased. So the ratio of corporate R&D to GDP, for example, has gone up by 60% over the last 30 years, but productivity growth has slowed down. The second trend that this paper deals with is the decline of business dynamism. And business dynamism is the process of productive firms entering the economy and growing, and unproductive firms shrinking or eventually exiting the economy. One measure of that is the entry rate. That's the fraction of all firms that's new. That's gone from 14 to 8% over the last 30 years. Another measure is the relocation rate. It's a measure of how quickly employees switch employers. That's gone from 30 to 23% in the US. And the last trend that I'll deal with is the rise of corporate market power. That's the one that is most contentious because it's harder to measure. But there is some evidence that markups, for example, are increasing. The labor share seems to be falling, and also there's been an increase in product market concentration. So there's an increasing number of sectors where a couple of firms are responsible for a large share of output. Now, in this paper, I relate these three trends to the rise of intangible inputs. When I say intangible inputs, I particularly mean software, other forms of information technology, which have rapidly become more important over the last 30 years. To give you one measure here, this is intangible investments measured as a sum of software and economic competencies investments. That's gone from 6 to 12% of corporate value added. And a large share of that increase is purely due to the rise of software. So software alone in the US today is almost 20% of corporate investments. Now, what I show in this paper is that the rise of intangible inputs can explain the trends in productivity, business dynamism, and market power. And intangibles can explain these things because they have two features. And I take these two features from the literature. The first feature is that intangibles endogenously raise fixed costs and reduce marginal costs. And that's because intangibles are almost free to duplicate. If someone writes a piece of code that can be duplicated at almost zero marginal cost, right? So if Tesla builds the software to run the autopilot of their car, whether they install that in one car or in a million cars, almost comes at no additional costs, but it does add value, right? So as intangibles become more important as a component in value added, there's a shift away from marginal cost, but you do have to pay for the intangibles, so there's an increase in fixed costs. In the paper, I show this. So I show with the new measure that fixed costs have increased, and that when firms adopt IT systems or invest in software, they do have an increase in the ratio of fixed to total costs. But I'll leave the empirics away from this presentation for time's sake. The second feature of intangibles is that firms differ in the efficiency with which they deploy them. By that, I mean that for the same expenditure on fixed cost intangibles, some firms are able to reduce their marginal cost by a greater fraction than others. There's a literature showing that, and it's showing that within very narrowly defined industries for firms with similar ages, of similar sizes. I'm going to be agnostic about the source of that efficiency, but it is going to be a key ingredient of the exercise. So what I do in the paper is I embed intangibles modeled along those lines into a model of endogenous growth with creative destruction. So creative destruction means that firms innovate, they come up with better goods, and by doing so, they're able to gain market share, and conversely, other firms lose out. In that model, so I'm going to take a state-of-the-art endogenous growth model, and I'm going to introduce intangibles and then introduce a group of firms that is very good at using intangibles. So say somewhere at the end of the 1980s, this is going to be the entry of Amazon and Jeff Bezos and Microsoft into the market. And then I'm going to analyze both in the short and the long term what happens with productivity growth, business dynamism, and market power. Now, just to give you the mechanism in a nutshell, in the kind of model that I work with, so a Schumpeterian endogenous growth model, firms innovate by developing higher quality versions of goods that other firms produce. So firms invest in research and development, which is not the kind of intangibles that I talk about, right? But they invest in innovation, research and development. And if they're successful, they come up with a good that is a higher quality version of a good that initially some other firm produces. And that works along a quality ladder. So firms produce at a certain level of efficiency. There's an incumbent that produces at a certain level of efficiency, and an innovator jumps on a higher step on the quality ladder. Now, normally in these models, whenever a firm does that, so whenever a firm jumps higher on that quality ladder, it becomes a new producer. And that's because all firms typically have the same production efficiency. So in a model with Bertrand competition, the innovator, because it has the highest level of quality, then becomes a new market leader. Now, intangibles change that because they introduce a new trade-off between quality and price. That's because, say, the incumbent that produces at a lower level of quality than the innovator, say that incumbent is an IT superstar, is a firm that is very good at using software or is very good at using intangibles, then even though that firm is not as high as the innovator on the quality ladder, it can sell its goods so cheaply that for consumers, if you add up quality and price, it's still more effective to purchase the goods from the initial incumbents. So the incumbents, if they're good at using intangibles, they can undercut innovators on price by selling cheaply, therefore preventing this process of creative destruction from generating long-term growth. So that's going to be the main mechanism today. Now, in the paper, there's both theory and empirics. There's micro-evidence on the universe of French firms, because I have access to census data for France, and there's an analysis of listed firms in the US. And I show in the paper that fixed costs have increased over time. I show that fixed costs are higher in IT sectors, but I particularly show that this increase in fixed costs has happened across industries. When firms adopt intangibles, their fixed costs go up, and I show some further details on the mechanisms. But that's not in today's presentation. So today, because we've got only half an hour, I'm going to focus on the theory. So it's an endogenous growth model with heterogeneous multi-product firms. I'm going to show you a structural estimation of that firm. Of that model, and then I'm going to show you what the effect of this rise of high intangible firms is. Now, my model is going to be able to explain about half of the slowdown of productivity growth in the US. It's going to explain most of the decline in dynamism, so entry, relocation, and about 2/3 of the rise of markups. But those are long-term effects. So initially, the model is going to predict a boom in productivity. And that's because when these high intangible firms initially enter the market, they want to produce all goods out there. So they become very expensive. They produce more efficiently. So productivity rises. So there's an initial boom, but there's a subsequent slowdown in productivity growth, which, as I'll show you, is exactly what you see in the data. I'm going to skip the related literature. I'm going to present the outline of the model, so I won't cover everything in detail, but I'll cover most grounds. So the baseline model is inspired by Klette-Kortum 2004. It's a model where time is continuous. Consumers have simple log utility in elastic labor supply. That's all very simple. The more interesting things happen on the firm size, on the firm side. So there's a continuum of goods in the economy. Goods are indexed by J, and firms, which are indexed by I, produce either one or multiple of these goods. Now, firms can produce any good that they own the patent to produce, and a patent grants a firm the right to produce a certain good at a certain level of quality, QIG. Now, quality enters through the aggregator. So this here is the expression for GDP. On the outside here, we have the integral over the various goods in the economy. That's J here. And on the inside here, we have total production of a certain good. Now, that good can potentially be produced by multiple firms, because every firm that has the patent to produce good J can produce it. And total production of a certain firm is equal to the quantity that it produces multiplied by the quality at which it produces. Now, again, potentially multiple firms can produce a good. However, firms compete à la Bertrand. So in the end, there is going to be only one firm producing, and that's going to be the firm that is able to offer the greatest amount of quality times output. So for a given spending on the goods, the greatest level of quality, the highest quality adjusted for price. Now, the main innovation in the model is the introduction of intangibles, and intangibles enter through the production structure. In particular, a firm is able to reduce its marginal cost by committing to a certain level of fixed cost. So the basic production function is very simple. There's just going to be one tangible input. It's going to be labor. So this here is the labor that firm I dedicates to the production of good J, and this is total output. And this term here captures intangibles. So firms choose basically their production efficiency. They choose a fraction Sij by which they reduce the marginal cost of producing that good J. And W here is just a wage rate for labor. So in exchange for reducing your marginal cost, the firm has to it has to commit to paying higher fixed costs, and these fixed costs increase convexly in Sij. So that means that every firm is going to have some marginal cost, because at some point it becomes very expensive to reduce your marginal cost. But they also depend on this firm level parameter phi, and that's going to be a key parameter because that's a parameter for a firm's IT talent. So a firm with a high phi is going to be better at IT or better at intangibles than its incumbent. And in practice, that's going to mean that for the same expenditure on fixed costs, so for the same F, some firms are going to be able to reduce their marginal costs by a greater fraction than others. and this efficiency is assigned to a firm's at birth. So if a firm wants to grow, it needs to invest in innovation. And when they invest in innovation, they employ researchers in order to come up with patents to produce goods that the firm doesn't yet produce. There's a cost function for that. I won't go over all of the parameter names, but key here is that firms choose the rate at which they get a patent to produce a good that they don't yet produce. And they pay, and in exchange, they have to employ this number of researchers, and this parameter here, psi x exceeds 1. That's a standard assumption. It's an assumption which means that there's convexity in the costs of R&D, which means that if a firm doubles its expenditure on R&D, it doesn't double its growth rate. And that's going to be a key result later to get both an increase in aggregate R&D, as we see in the data, but a decline in growth rates. Now, if a firm invests in R&D and it gets a patent, it gets the patent to produce a good that is currently produced by a different firm at a higher level of quality. So the quality at which the firm gets to produce, that's Qij, is equal to the quality at which the current incumbent, which is minus I, is able to produce, multiplied by some step. And this step is random, it's exponentially distributed, which means that usually firms have a small improvement over other firms, but if they're lucky, they get a big improvement over the quality that other firms produce it. And normally in these models, because there's background competition, whenever a firm successfully innovates, whenever it gets a patent, it becomes a new producer. That's because all firms have the same production efficiency, and so the firm that is able to produce the highest level of quality is going to be the market leader. And in this model, there's going to be a new trade-off between quality and price, and that's because it might be the case that the incumbent is able to produce so cheaply that even though it doesn't have the highest level of quality, it is still the most attractive good to consumers. So the inequality that matters is whether the innovation step size, right? So the quality improvement that the innovator happens to draw, whether that exceeds the ratio of choke prices between firms. Right? And so the higher a firm's phi, so the better the firm is at intangibles, the more efficiently it can produce, and so the lower its choke price is, right? So the lower the prices at which the firm is able to make a non-negative profit. So entry in the model works as follows. There's a continuum of potential entrants. There's an entry rate, E, and firms, and these entrants are trying to enter the economy. Now, if one of the entrants is lucky and it comes up with the patent to produce a good that is currently produced by an incumbent, then it draws its level of efficiency. So this is as in an Oppenheim or a Mellitz type of model. Entrants know with which probability they're going to be a firm that is good at intangibles or bad at intangibles. There is a discrete number of firm types. And they know the probability, but they only find out how good they are at IT if they come up with a patent to produce a good. Now, again, in the standard model, these firms would always enter, but in this model, they only enter if it turns out that their innovation step size is sufficiently large to overcome any difference in choke price. Right? So if a firm is the most efficient producer out there, if it's Amazon, it has the lowest choke price, so it always becomes a new producer. But if a firm is bad at IT, it is only able to enter if it was lucky enough to draw a large quality improvement compared to its competitors. Firms exit if they lose goods, so firms potentially produce multiple goods, and if a different firm becomes better at producing one of their goods, they cease producing that good, right? That's called creative destruction. And if a firm loses the final good that it produces, that's when it exits the economy and the firm dies. So in terms of optimization, this is the optimal price that a firm charges. So because there's background competition, there's limit pricing. So the price that the firm that ends up producing charges is equal to the marginal cost of the second best firm, corrected for any quality difference between those firms. So the price is equal to the marginal cost of the other firm, corrected for any quality differences. Now, these quality differences are just the innovation step size, and this is important, the marginal cost of the second best firm is just equal to the wage rate. And that's because the second best firm in a Nash equilibrium is never going to reduce its marginal costs through committing to fixed cost intangibles, because then they would be paying for these intangibles, but it wouldn't be benefiting from the increase in production efficiency, right? So only the firm that ends up producing is the one that purchases these fixed cost intangibles. So because of that, it's very easy to derive what the markup is. So the markup that firm I is able to charge on the sale of good J is equal to the ratio of its price to its marginal cost, right, by definition. But if you insert the price, you get that the firm's markup is increasing in the quality difference that it has. So if you have a big innovation step size, you get rewarded with a higher markup, and it increases in the fraction by which you reduce your marginal costs. As if you want to see what is the mechanical part of this paper, it's that markups increase almost automatically when firms use more intangibles, simply because it increases the wedge between their marginal cost and the marginal cost of the second best firm. However, this setup also means that markups are going to overstate firm profitability, because as firms use more intangibles, they raise their markup, but part of that is to cover intangibles. So they do become more profitable, but markups overstate profitability. So in terms of the optimization problem, so the incumbents choose how much to innovate. So they choose at what rate to have patents. Now, I'm not going to go through the whole equation here. The point here is, though, that if a firm has a higher phi, so a firm that is good at using intangibles, that firm is going to choose a higher innovation rate. That's for three reasons. First, if you're a high phi firm, you're more likely to be able to beat the incumbent because you are able at using intangibles, you have a low choke price, and therefore there's less of a risk that there's an even better firm out there with which you have to compete. Secondly, firms with a high phi are more profitable because they're able to charge a higher markup. They do have to pay for the fixed cost, but overall they're more profitable. So that's a second reason why they want to sell more. And finally, they reduce. They discount the value of future profits that come from producing a good at a lower discount rate, because a smaller fraction of all innovators is able to beat them. So these high phi firms in the model are going to be very innovative and are going to spend a lot on research and development. So the main experiment. Initially, I calibrate the model to match moments for 1980 in the United States. I also in the paper have a separate calibration for France based on French microdata, but I'll leave that for next time for the paper. And I'm going to start from a steady state where firms use equally low levels of intangibles. So initially we're going to ignore this heterogeneity across firms in terms of their phi, and we're going to equate them across firms. The shock in the model. Let me see how I'm on time. I mean, I can quickly show you some details of the estimation. I'll show you just how well the moments match. So here, I show you for the US what the data targets for the main parameters are and what the model is. So the average innovation step size, so that's the average for the exponential distribution, is such that the growth rate is 1.3%, both in data and in model. I target the initial phi to match the ratio of fixed to variable costs of US firms in Compustat in 1980. And these are parameters that relate to the innovation process. And what the model is able to do is it's able to replicate the firm size, firm growth relationship, deviation from Gibbert's law very well. It's able to match entry quite well. So this is a cost parameter for entry. And then there's a cost parameter for R&D intensity, such that I match the ratio of R&D over sales in the data. So that seems to be quite well. I can show you the other moments after the presentation. So the shock to the model, so I'm starting from the steady state where firms use similar levels of intangibles. And then the shock is that from some point on, say at the end of the 1980s, a fraction of all entrants is assigned a higher intangible efficiency. And this higher intangible efficiency is calibrated to match the empirical rise in the use of intangibles in production, as well as the decline in entry. That's the shock. And then I'm going to analyze both the long and the short-term effects on productivity growth, dynamism, and market power. Just in terms of mechanism, there's a slight paradox here in that what I've discussed earlier is that high intangible firms invest a lot in research and development and innovate strongly. Now, the point of this paper is to explain why productivity growth in the data has slowed down. And I'm going to create that by having a group of firms that is very innovative. The key thing there is that the level of intangible efficiency is going to be more unequal after the shock. If you would give a higher level of FI to all firms in the economy, so if all firms would be as good in the use of IT as, say, Amazon is, then there would be higher innovation rates and there would be an increase in productivity growth because markups would increase, so the incentive to innovate would rise. However, in a world where I change the FI such that there's a mean preserving spread, so some firms become very good at intangibles and some firms become very bad, there's actually a decline in innovation rates and a reduction in growth. That's because while there's going to be a group of firms that invests a lot in R&D, there's also going to be a group of firms that is unable to compete with these high intangible firms, so they don't try to enter the market. And importantly, there's also a decline in entry. The reason entry declines when you introduce some firms that are very good at IT and some firms that are very bad at IT is that when I'm an entrant, say I have a 10% chance of being one of these high IT firms, there's a much higher probability that I'll have to beat one of these high intangible firms to enter the market. And that's because these high intangible firms are going to expand a lot, they invest a lot in R&D, and they end up producing nearly all goods, even if only a small fraction of entrants is talented at IT. So you end up with an economy where most production is done by these high intangible firms. Right, so the experiment that I have is not a mean preserving spread. I'm just going to add a group of firms that is very good at IT. And so the ex ante effect of that is ambiguous. On the one hand, it raises the average level of FI, but it also increases the variance because not all firms get this higher level. So it turns out that the overall effect is negative, but there's nothing baked into the model that would guarantee that. So potentially intangibles would have had a positive effect. In terms of qualitative results, I'm able to get the directions of change right for all of the objects that I'm interested in. Productivity growth declines, R&D is going to increase, dynamism falls, market power increases, and there's an increase in the use of intangibles. Quantitatively, in the data, productivity growth in the US fell by 0.9 percentage points. In the model, it's going to be 0.4. The ratio of corporate R&D to value added increased in the data by 65%, and in the model it's going to be 42%. That's because there's going to be some firms that invest a lot, and combined with these convex costs of R&D, that means that when you get this inequality in R&D investments, there's an overall reduction in the rate of return to R&D. So that's why you get this both reduction in growth and increase in R&D. I target the decline of entry, so I match that, and I get an overshoot for the decline in the reallocation rate, and that's because all growth in the model involves creative destruction. And I'm able to explain about 2/3 of the rise of markups. So in terms of dynamics, this is what the path of productivity growth in the economy looks like. So there's initially, so at time 0 here, this is when for the first time these high intangible firms enter the market. That causes a boom in productivity growth. On the one hand, because there's a high incentive for these high intangible firms to expand, to invest in R&D, but also because these firms produce more efficiently. So the yellow line here is how much quality improves here. The blue line is how much total productivity improves, and the wedge between the two is due to increases in production efficiency purely due to intangibles. So you get a lot of additional growth due to the rise of IT, due to the rise of intangibles, as is shown in the data. If you want to compare the exact timing, here I have the same graph as before. So the blue line here is the same as before, but I've rescaled the axis. And this is what happened with productivity in the US. So productivity is a very volatile variable, so you don't get, of course, the same smoothness in the data. But if you look at the years 2000 to 2005, you get a boom in productivity growth that lasts about 6 years, exactly like I have in the model. And it raises productivity growth to about 1.9%, which is also what I have in the model. And there's nothing that is targeted there, right? So the whole duration in the model is not pinned down by anything, and this might have as well been a 100-year transition, but it turns out that these models are very good at replicating the empirical facts. If you look at R&D intensity, this is R&D intensity in the data. Again, if you compare it to the model, there's a similar timing, despite the fact that timing is untargeted, and also the increase is not targeted. So this is for composite firms R&D over sales. That's gone from 2.5 to almost 9% in the model. And that's exactly what you see for CompuStat firms in the data. And again, that's not targeted. The timing for the decline in entry is similar. And also, if you look at the rise of markups, you get a very similar timing, although there the axes have scaled differently, right? So the scale is the same, as in both series show a similar increase in markups, but I don't target the initial level of markup, so there's a mismatch there. But it turns out that the model lasts about 30 years to transition to the new steady state. The rise of markups in the model, and this is not on the slides, also creates a reduction in the labor force, in the labor share, due to the standard product market power channel. And in the model, that's going to create a wedge between wages and productivity. So in the model, productivity booms, but wages don't track that boom. And that's because when firms increase their productivity by the use of intangibles, they exactly proportionally are able to increase their markups. And that offsets the effect on wages. So the model predicts a divergence between wages and productivity because markups increase. So in summary, the aim of this paper is to explain why productivity growth has fallen despite the fact that investments into productivity have increased. And it explains the fall in dynamism and the rise of corporate market power. I show that intangibles that reduce marginal cost and raise fixed cost and have unequal adoption costs across firms can explain these trends both qualitatively and quantitatively. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much, Martin. While we wait for questions from the floor, I have a question myself. So, if we have to think about the financial side of your firms, well, your paper is not about this, but typically firms using a lot of intangibles have a lower capacity, at least at the start of their business, to access credit because intangibles can hardly be collateralized, especially when they are under development. On the other side, more traditional firms might have an easier capacity to access credit because they have a higher collateral. So if I have to adapt to your story, what happens on the financial side, that is maybe a lower capacity of firms, at least in the initial stage of their life, which use a lot of intangibles to access credit, and an increasing capacity of firms with a higher traditional capital to access the credit market. To which extent do you think that your story about explaining these main trends, these three trends, is going to be impaired if you account for the financial side of these firms?
I think that's a very interesting question. I've actually not had it on the market, so thanks for that. I think you're partly right that intangibles are harder to collateralize. There is also increasing evidence that with the rise of debt confidence, this penalty for intangibles is falling over time. But it's also true that some of the most cash-heavy firms are exactly the firms that have invested a lot in intangibles, right? So there does seem to be a relationship. In terms of how it relates to my paper, I'd say that in my model, incumbents' advantage comes from the fact that a lot of incumbents end up being these high intangible firms that can undercut competitors on price. Right? There's nothing innate about intangibles other than that, or there's nothing about purely the fact that you're an incumbent that gives you that advantage. In a model where, say, incumbents would have greater access to intangibles because they have cash that an entrant would not have, that would increase the incumbent's advantage. So that would make it even harder for new firms to enter in markets that are currently dominated by a cash-heavy, high intangible firms, right? Right? So I would say that it would make it harder to enter and therefore strengthen the mechanism that I have in mind.
Okay, thank you. So I have a question from the audience, Patrick Moran from the University of Copenhagen. In your model, what policy solutions would allow us to prevent the fall in dynamism and slow down in productivity that you document?
What the sort of policy response would be. So in a model, I mean, there's two answers to this. There's a sort of technical answer and the real life answer, right? So I think in terms of the technical answer, optimal subsidies for entry are going to be very efficient. And in any endogenous growth model, subsidies for research and development have very large welfare gains. I have a very simple model where labor is supplied exogenously. So you would tax the hell out of labor, and it would all be well. But obviously, you could do some sort of optimal taxation, optimal subsidy exercise. I think in practice, in policy circles, the way that people think about this subject is through the lens of diffusion. Right? So there's nothing innate about intangibles that is welfare reducing, even though in my calibration exercise, there's actually a negative, I find a negative welfare effect, but it's because of the inequality in the access to intangible technologies. Right? So anything that makes the FI more accessible is going to have a positive welfare effect. And I think if you look at what competition policymakers, but also innovation directorates at the OECD or the European Commission are saying, it's exactly about that. It's about improving diffusion.
Great, thank you. I'll give a word to Federico Ravenna from the National Bank of Denmark. He has a question too.
Hey, Martin, a really interesting presentation. Thank you. I have the following question.
Federico, can you adjust the microphone, please?
Yeah. Sorry about that. I have a question concerning policy also. It seems that a lot of what's driving your results and also results in similar models where there is a winner takes all effect and you just all advantages of R&D accrue to the leader in a market or the ones that has the largest market share. What can you imagine will happen when this when markups become 100% of the marginal cost and you have this more of this winner takes all effect? Will we see policy intervening, or will we all become entrepreneurs because our labor share is falling so fast? So this is a comment. It's hard for me to imagine that the rest of the economic structure will stay static as it is if productivity keeps slowing and the markups keep increasing. So what do you think will happen for the future?
I mean, well, if I could tell the future, I'd be on the stock market. No, to be serious, in the model, it's not as if markups keep growing forever, right? So there's a divergence, but it stops at some point, and it stops at the point that these high intangible firms basically produce their steady state level of products in the economy, right? So once Amazon produces everything, there's no way that it can grow further. So you don't get this infinite divergence of markups and productivity. You see, it is divergence of wage and productivity. It's supposed to stabilize at some point.
Okay, well, thanks, Federico. I think we have time for another question. Morten, would you like to intervene?
Yeah, very interesting paper. I just wonder about how does this line up with the Baki-Fari evidence on reallocation and productivity?
So I would say it provides an explanation for it. So the Baki-Fari paper basically shows that this rise of markups is because firms that have high markups grow bigger over time, and not because a firm's own markups have increased, right? That's the result in a nutshell. That's exactly what happens in my paper. So these high intangible firms have high markups, and they grow over time by producing an increasing number of goods. Therefore, the fraction of economic activity that is produced by them increases over time. So that raises the aggregate markup. But it's because firms that already have a high markup, that have always had a high markup, become bigger. So I think that's in line.
Okay.
Well, thanks very much. Well, it seems there are no more questions. So, right. Well, thanks, Martin. It's been very interesting, and thanks both you and Karin for the session. So leave it there. Let me just remind you that I'm going to post you right now a link for a post-session discussion drinks. And I guess that link is already open. Thanks very much, everybody.